Before we begin tonight's journey, a small and quiet request. If you find peace and wonder in these long historical explorations, consider subscribing to The Hypnotic Historian and leaving a like on this video. It helps more than you might imagine, and it keeps this little corner of YouTube alive and breathing. And while you settle in, I want to ask you something. Drop it in the comments below, because I genuinely love reading every single one. Where in the world are you right now? And what time is it as you listen to this? Are you in a warm room somewhere in Europe? Rain against the glass? Are you lying in the darkness in Australia? The southern stars invisible behind your ceiling? Are you in North America, the house finally quiet after a long day? Tell me. Tell me your country, your hour, your corner of this vast world. Because what we are about to talk about belongs to every single one of you, wherever you are. It belongs to every human being who has ever looked up at the sky and asked the oldest question there is. There is a moment, you may have felt it yourself, that arrives without warning. It comes at strange hours, in the middle of the night when sleep refuses to come, or at dusk when the sky turns that peculiar shade between amber and violet, or sometimes in the middle of the most ordinary day, standing in a grocery store, stirring a cup of tea, walking along a familiar road, when the whole world seems to pause and something inside you asks a question so enormous it almost takes your breath away. How did all of this begin? Not just this afternoon, not just your life or your city or your country, not just the history of nations and empires and wars, but all of it, the stars, the darkness between them, the ground beneath your feet, the ocean, the atoms in your blood, the very fact that anything exists at all instead of nothing. How did it start? Why is there something rather than nothing? And where, in all of this vast and ancient unfolding, do you fit? That question is not modern. It is not the product of philosophy departments or scientific laboratories or internet forums at 2 a.m. That question is as old as the human mind itself. It is, in a very real sense, the first question our species ever asked. And for as long as human beings have been gathering round fires in the darkness, looking up at the stars with their limited but burning intelligence, they have been reaching for an answer. Tonight, or this morning, or this quiet afternoon, wherever you are, we're going to travel through that long and luminous journey together. We're going to walk through the caves of our earliest ancestors, sit beside the campfires of the first storytellers, kneel in the temples of civilizations that have long since turned to dust. We're going to listen to the creation myths of peoples whose names are unfamiliar to most of us now, whose languages no longer exist, whose cities were swallowed by the earth. And we're going to discover that what they felt, what they needed, what drove them to sit up in the night and reach for an explanation, is exactly what you and I feel. We're going to trace this thread, this single, ancient, golden thread of human curiosity, all the way from the very first cave paintings to the Hubble Space Telescope, from the earliest priestesses chanting in Mesopotamian temples to the physicists at CERN who watch particles collide and try to read in the wreckage a clue about the first moments of the universe. And what we will discover along the way is something quieter and stranger and more beautiful than any single answer could ever be. We will discover what it means to be a creature that asks. Think for a moment about what it would feel like to be alive 50,000 years ago. The numbers are so large they lose their meaning, so let us make them smaller. Imagine a single night. A night in what we now call southern France, or perhaps in the hills of what would become the Fertile Crescent. The sky above is identical to the sky above you right now. The same stars, the same constellations, the same slow wheel of the Milky Way turning through the dark. There is no light pollution. The stars are not points but presences, and the darkness between them is not emptiness but weight. A fire is burning. Around it, perhaps a dozen people are gathered. They are not so different from you in their minds. The same brain, the same capacity for language and memory and imagination, the same aching need for warmth and safety and belonging. A child is asleep. An elder is watching the fire. Someone is sharpening a bone tool with patient rhythmic strokes. And someone, perhaps a young man, perhaps a woman with paint-stained fingers, is looking up at the sky with that expression that you yourself have worn at some point in your life. That open, wondering, slightly frightened expression. The one that says, I cannot stop thinking about this. I need to understand. What were they looking at? What were they thinking? We cannot know for certain, but we have clues. We have the paintings they left behind on cave walls, paintings of animals and human hands and strange geometric shapes that we're only beginning to understand. We have the careful orientations of their burial sites, aligned to the rising sun or the path of the moon. We have the ochre they sprinkled over their dead, a gesture so deliberate, so full of intention, that it speaks clearly across 50,000 years. These people believed that death was not the end. These people believed the world had a pattern. These people believed the pattern could be understood. That is where our story begins. Not with a text, not with a philosophy, not with a laboratory. It begins with that young person beside the fire, looking up, feeling the weight of the question settle into their chest like a stone dropped into deep water, feeling it sink, feeling it ask. What came before all of this? The asking of that question, the very impulse itself, is one of the most extraordinary things about our species. Other animals are remarkable in countless ways. Elephants mourn their dead, crows use tools, octopuses solve puzzles that would frustrate a child. Dolphins have complex social languages, but no other animal, as far as we know, has ever looked at the world around it and asked, how did all of this begin? No other animal has ever felt the need to construct an explanation for its own existence. No other creature has ever told a creation story. This is what makes us strange. This is what makes us in some ways almost unbearably vulnerable, because the question once asked cannot be unasked. Once you have noticed the gap, the absolute mystery at the heart of existence, the simple dizzying fact that the universe began somehow, that you yourself somehow came to be, you cannot unfeel it. It becomes part of you. It becomes, in a very real sense, the foundation of everything you build on top of it. Your religion, your philosophy, your science, your art, your sense of identity, your understanding of why your life matters. Every civilization that has ever existed on this earth has grappled with this question. Every culture, every tribe, every nation, every empire. The Sumerians who built the first cities in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. The ancient Egyptians who aligned their pyramids with the stars. The philosophers of Athens who sat in the afternoon light and argued about the nature of reality. The astronomers of medieval Islam who mapped the heavens with extraordinary precision. The indigenous peoples of every continent who carried their creation stories in their memories across thousands of years of oral tradition. The Renaissance thinkers who dared to imagine a universe larger than the church allowed. The scientists of the last 2 centuries who dismantled and rebuilt our understanding of time, space, matter, and origin so completely that even they sometimes struggle to believe what the evidence tells them. All of them, every single one, were reaching for the same thing. They were reaching for the beginning. And here is what is perhaps the most humbling and beautiful truth of all. The quest is not over. After 50,000 years of trying, after every creation myth, every philosophical treatise, every scientific breakthrough, every telescope and particle accelerator and genome sequence, we still do not have a complete answer. We have better answers than our ancestors did. We have extraordinarily precise answers in some areas, but the deepest questions, why is there something rather than nothing? What existed before the Big Bang? What consciousness truly is and how it arose from matter? What the ultimate origin and destiny of the universe might be? These remain as open as they have ever been. We are still, in our most honest moments, the same people as the one beside that ancient fire, still looking up, still reaching, still asking. That is not a cause for despair. That is, I think, something very close to the definition of what it means to be alive. So pull yourself a little closer to the warmth of this story. Let the night be what it is, and let us begin at the very beginning, or as close to it as we can get. Long before there were laboratories, long before there were universities or libraries or books, long before there was even writing, human beings were explaining the world. They did it the only way available to them, with stories. A story, in this ancient sense, was not entertainment. It was not a pastime, not a luxury, not a form of escape. A story was a technology. It was the most sophisticated tool that early human minds had developed, more useful in many ways than the sharpened flint or the shaped bone, because a story could be carried anywhere, could be transmitted from one mind to another without any physical medium, could survive the death of its original teller and persist through generations. A story was a way of storing knowledge, organizing experience and making sense of the terrifying and wondrous world that pressed in on every side, and the most important stories, the ones that were told and retold with the greatest care, the ones that were performed at the most sacred moments, the ones that were guarded by the most powerful members of the community, were the creation stories. The stories that answered the question before all other questions. How did any of this come to be? These stories are what scholars call cosmogonies, from the Greek words for world and birth. They are the birth stories of everything. And when you begin to look at them across cultures, across continents, across the vast range of human civilization, something remarkable happens. The specific details are different, wildly, gloriously, bewilderingly different. But the underlying shapes, the emotional architecture, the deep needs they are responding to, these are almost always the same. Let us travel through some of them together, gently, taking our time. The waters of the beginning, Mesopotamia. We begin in the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, the region that now forms much of modern Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. It is here, in the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, that some of the earliest writing appeared, and among the first things human beings chose to write down were their creation stories. The Enuma Elish is perhaps the oldest written cosmogony we possess. It was inscribed on clay tablets in the Babylonian cuneiform script, and it tells a story that is at once strange and deeply familiar. In the beginning, says the Enuma Elish, there was nothing but water. Two kinds of water, Apsu, the fresh water that lay beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the salt water of the sea. And these two primal waters were mingled together in a formless, boundless darkness, before sky, before earth, before anything had a name or a shape. From this mingling gods were born, younger, noisier, more energetic than the ancient, slow, primal waters. These younger gods disturbed Apsu and Tiamat with their activities, and conflict arose. Eventually, through a long series of battles and transformations too rich and complex to summarize briefly, the young god Marduk slew the great goddess Tiamat and used her body, literally split her apart, to create the sky and the earth. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Her tail became the Milky Way. This is a story about conflict and creation being linked. It is a story that says the world was not simply made from nothing, but made from something. from a primal substance, and from the violence of transformation. It is also, when you read it carefully, a story about the political order of Babylon itself. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, is the hero, and his supremacy in the story mirrors the supremacy of Babylon among the cities of Mesopotamia. Creation myths are almost always also political documents. They explain not just how the world came to be, but why things are arranged the way they are right now, why this city is important, why this king has power, why things are structured as they are. But beneath the politics, the myth speaks to something older and deeper. Water as the primal substance. This appears in creation stories from all over the ancient world, from the Egyptian Nun to the biblical Tehom, from the Vedic primordial ocean to the Aboriginal stories of the Dreamtime. Water was the first answer to the question of what existed before everything else, because water was everywhere, and because water could take any shape, and because water, unlike stone or fire, was something that could contain other things. Water was the most convincing candidate for the stuff from which everything else might have been made. The egg of the world, ancient Egypt. Cross the desert westward, and you come to the Nile, and to a civilization that was obsessed with beginnings in the most profound and practical sense. The ancient Egyptians did not have a single creation story. They had several, each associated with a different priestly center and a different god, and they seem to have held these multiple stories simultaneously without feeling any need to choose between them. This is worth pausing over. The Egyptians were not troubled by having more than one explanation. They understood, in some intuitive way, that the mystery was large enough to require more than one approach. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the oldest and most widely influential, creation began with Atum, a self-created god who existed in the primordial waters of Nun, floating in the darkness before anything else existed. Atum was alone, and Atum was everything. Through an act of self-generation, sometimes described as masturbation, sometimes as spitting, sometimes as simply speaking, Atum brought forth the first pair of gods, Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. These two then produced Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And Geb and Nut, separated by their father Shu, who held them apart, produced Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, the gods whose stories would dominate Egyptian religious life for 3,000 years. In the Hermopolitan tradition, associated with the city of Kemenu, there was a different beginning. The Ogdoad, 8 primordial deities arranged in 4 pairs, each pair representing a quality of the primordial chaos. Nun and Naunet for the primordial waters, Her and Hauher for infinity, Kek and Kauket for darkness, and Amun and Amunet for the hidden or invisible. These 8 deities together formed the conditions from which creation could emerge, and out of them came a mound of earth from the waters, and on that mound an egg from which the sun was born. The cosmic egg. Here is another motif that travels with remarkable persistence through human culture. The world egg appears in Hinduism, in Orphic Greek religion, in Finnish mythology, in Chinese creation stories. The idea is one of extraordinary intuitive power. The egg is the perfect image of potential. Inside an egg, before it hatches, there is nothing visible, just a sealed, self-contained darkness. And then, from that darkness, life breaks through. The cosmos is like an egg. From a single contained beginning, everything hatches into being. Darkness and the Word, the Vedic tradition, travel east, across the great desert and the mountain ranges, into the Indian subcontinent, and you find creation stories of astonishing philosophical sophistication, stories that were composed in some cases more than 3,000 years ago, and still echo with a depth that modern cosmology sometimes seems to be only now catching up to. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in any Indo-European language, contains what is perhaps the most honest creation hymn ever written. It is called the Nasadiya Sukta, the Hymn of Creation, and it begins in a way that no other ancient cosmogony quite dares to begin, with an admission of total uncertainty. Then there was neither non-existence nor existence. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond it. What covered in, and where, and what gave shelter? Was there water depthlessly deep? There was neither death nor immortality then. There was no distinguishing sign of night or day. That one breathed windless by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. The hymn continues in this vein, probing the mystery with a kind of philosophical honesty that is breathtaking for its age, and it ends with one of the most remarkable passages in all of ancient literature, a passage that acknowledges the possibility that even the gods do not know the answer, and that perhaps no one does. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? The gods came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? Whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it, in the highest heaven, only he knows. Or perhaps he does not know. Read those last 5 words again slowly. Perhaps he does not know. Here, in one of the oldest texts in the world, there is a creator who might not understand his own creation. There is a cosmos that might have formed itself. There is an honest, aching acknowledgement that the question may not have an answer accessible to any being, human or divine. This is not nihilism. It is not despair. It is something rarer and more courageous. It is intellectual humility in the face of the genuinely unknowable. Other Vedic and later Hindu traditions offered more structured stories. The universe emanating from Brahman, the absolute reality, unfolding through vast cycles of creation and dissolution. The god Vishnu sleeping on the cosmic serpent Shesha in the primordial ocean, and from his navel growing a lotus, and from that lotus being born Brahma, who then creates the world. These stories have a cyclical quality. The universe is not created once and for all, but is created and destroyed and recreated on timescales so vast that even the gods are dwarfed by them. Brahma lives for 100 Brahma years, each year consisting of 3.1 trillion human years. When Brahma dies, everything dissolves, and another Brahma is born, and it all begins again. This cyclical cosmology, the universe pulsing in and out of existence through unimaginable spans of time, is strikingly resonant with some of the most speculative modern physics, which includes theories of oscillating universes and the eternal recurrence of cosmic beginnings. The ancient Vedic thinkers arrived at this image not through mathematics, but through meditation, through the attempt to think the very largest thoughts possible, and in doing so they touch something that may be genuinely true. In the beginning was the Word, the Hebrew and Christian tradition. The first words of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, are among the most analysed and discussed opening words of any text in human history. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Here again we find the waters, the primordial deep, Tehom in Hebrew, a word cognate with the Babylonian Tiamat. The deep existed before creation began. There was water and darkness, and the Spirit of God moving above it. And then God spoke. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The power of this cosmogony lies in its simplicity, and in the absolute authority it vests in the word, in language, in speech, in the act of naming. The world is not made from pre-existing substance shaped by violence, as in the Enuma Elish. It is made from nothing, ex nihilo, as the later theological tradition would say, by the simple act of divine speech. Things come into being when they are named. Light exists because God said the word light. Sky exists because God separated the waters and named the space between them. Land exists because God commanded the waters to draw back and let the dry ground appear. This places an extraordinary emphasis on language, on the creative power of the word. And this theme, logos, the word, as the creative principle of the universe, runs through much of Western and Near Eastern religious and philosophical thought. The Gospel of John, written in the late 1st century of the Common Era, opens with a deliberate echo of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is not just theology, it is a claim about the fundamental nature of reality, that meaning, language, the structuring principle of the mind, is not something we impose on a meaningless universe, but is woven into the fabric of existence from the very beginning. The Genesis story, with its 6 days of creation and its 7th day of rest, also gave Western civilization something it found extraordinarily productive and also at times profoundly uncomfortable: a linear conception of time. In most other ancient traditions, time was cyclical. The year, the seasons, the great astronomical cycles all reinforced a sense of time as something that returned upon itself. But Genesis imposed a beginning and, implicitly, an end. Time had a direction. The cosmos had a narrative arc. And this linear conception of history, the idea that the universe has a story, with a beginning, a middle, and eventually an end, is the conceptual foundation on which everything from the science of cosmology to the philosophy of history is built. The Great Dreaming, Aboriginal Australia. On the other side of the world, in the red deserts and coastal rainforests and ancient plains of Australia, a civilization existed for at least 65,000 years, the longest continuous cultural tradition in human history, and it told stories about the beginning of the world of extraordinary richness and complexity. The dreaming, or dream time, a term that is a rough translation of various words from different Aboriginal languages, refers not to dreams in the ordinary sleeping sense, but to the foundational time when the world was created by ancestral beings who moved across the primordial landscape, singing and walking and performing acts that shaped everything that exists. The rainbow serpent rose from the depths and carved the river valleys with its body. The Wandjina spirit shaped the humans. The Pleiades were women who were chased by the Orion hunters. Every feature of the landscape, every rock, every waterhole, every species of animal and plant was brought into being by the ancestral creators, and the stories of those creations are encoded in the landscape itself. The dreaming is not, crucially, simply in the past. It is ongoing. The ancestral beings did not finish their work and retire. They are still present, in the rocks, in the water, in the songs that initiated members of the community carry in their memory, and perform in ceremony to maintain the connection between the present world and the foundational time. To perform a ceremony incorrectly, to fail to maintain the sacred songs, is not merely a cultural failure, it is a cosmic one. It could result in the world losing its coherence, the waterholes drying up, the animals disappearing, the fabric of existence fraying. This is a creation cosmology in which human beings have an ongoing, active responsibility. We are not merely the beneficiaries of a creation that happened once in the distant past. We are its stewards, its singers, its continuers. The universe depends on us to keep it going, just as we depend on it to sustain us. This is a thought of radical intimacy between humanity and the cosmos, a refusal of the idea that creation is something that happened to us, and an insistence that creation is something we participate in, every day, through our attention, our ceremony, our care. The void and the sacrifice, Norse mythology, in the cold north of Europe, in the long winters of Scandinavia and Iceland, a different set of stories formed. The Norse cosmogony begins with a void, Ginnunga gap, the great emptiness, the yawning gulf. On one side of this void was Niflheim, a world of ice and darkness. On the other side was Muspelheim, a world of fire. Where the ice of Niflheim and the fire of Muspelheim met in the void, they interacted. The ice melted, the meltwater quickened, and from this interaction a being formed, Ymir, the first frost giant, the primal being from whose body the world would eventually be made. From the same melting ice a cow formed, Audumla, and she licked the ice, and from her licking a man emerged. Buri, the first of the gods. Buri's grandson, Odin, and his brothers slew Ymir and carried his body to the centre of Ginnunga gap, and from it they made the world. His flesh became the earth, his blood became the oceans, his bones became the mountains, his skull became the dome of the sky, held up at four corners by four dwarfs. His brain was scattered to become the clouds. The first humans, in the Norse telling, were Ask and Embla, an ash tree and an elm tree that Odin and his brothers found on the seashore and breathed life into. They gave them breath and consciousness and speech and warmth and appearance. The trees became people. This is a story about the porousness of the boundary between the human and the natural, a story that says we are not separate from nature, not placed in it from outside, but are ourselves made of it, raised from it, continuous with it. The Norse cosmogony is also notable for its eschatology, its story of the end. The universe that was made from violence would end in violence in Ragnarok, the great final battle in which gods and giants and monsters would destroy each other, and the world would sink into the sea. And then, in some versions, the world would rise again, green and renewed, and two humans hidden in the world tree Yggdrasil would emerge to repopulate it. Destruction and renewal, death and rebirth. This cycle runs through Norse thought as it runs through so many others. By now we've travelled through several of the world's great creation stories, and we've seen how different they are, how distinctive each culture's vision of the beginning is, how shaped by local geography and climate and social structure and historical circumstance. But we have also begun to see the patterns beneath the differences, the deep water, the primordial void, the cosmic egg, the divine word, the body of sacrifice from which the world is made. These themes recur because they are responses to the same underlying questions, the same underlying human needs. So what are those needs? Why do human beings feel this compulsion so acutely, so universally? Why can we not simply accept that things are as they are, without demanding to know how they came to be? The answer, when you dig into it, turns out to be not one thing but many. A cluster of interlocking psychological and existential drives, each of them real and powerful, each of them contributing to the vast and ancient project of asking where everything came from. The terror of randomness. The first and perhaps most primal of these drives is the terror of randomness. Human beings are extraordinarily bad at accepting that things happen without reason. We are pattern-seeking animals to an almost pathological degree. Our brains evolved in an environment where pattern recognition was a matter of life and death. The rustle in the grass that might be a predator, the dark cloud that might bring rain, the expression on another person's face that might signal danger or safety. Our ancestors, who were best at detecting patterns, even patterns that weren't there, survived. And those who were too cautious, who failed to see the pattern in the rustling grass and assumed it was nothing, were eaten. The result is that we are constitutionally incapable of seeing randomness without feeling a powerful urge to impose meaning on it. The technical term for this is apophenia. the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. We see faces in clouds. We see the hand of God in coincidences. We see conspiracy in chaos. And on a much grander and more profound scale, we see purpose in the universe itself, a design, a direction, an intention behind the fact that anything exists at all. A universe without origin, a universe that simply is, without any explanation for why it is psychologically intolerable for most human minds. It feels not just intellectually unsatisfying, but emotionally threatening. It suggests that we ourselves are accidents, that our existence is without meaning or purpose, that the love we feel and the choices we make and the lives we build are ultimately just noise in an indifferent void. The creation story, any creation story, is a defense against this terror. It says, the universe did not just happen. It was made, or it emerged, or it unfolded according to some principle or logic, and therefore you, who are part of it, are not accidental. You are part of something. The need for order. Closely related to this is the need for order, for the world to be structured, comprehensible, navigable. A creation story does not just explain the past, it establishes the present. It explains why the world is arranged the way it is, why certain things are as they are, why certain rules apply. The Egyptian creation story explained why the Nile flooded every year, because of the tears of the gods, or because of the annual battle between cosmic forces. The Babylonian creation story explained why human beings had to labour, because they were created specifically to do the work that the lesser gods refused to do. The Norse creation story explained why the world was hard and cold and full of danger, because it was made from the body of a slain giant, and the forces of chaos were always pressing at its edges. In each case, the story takes the given conditions of life, the flood, the labour, the cold, and integrates them into a larger narrative of meaning. The conditions are hard, but they make sense. They are where they are in the story. They serve a function. And because they serve a function, they can be endured. Not just endured, but accepted. Because they are part of a pattern that is larger than any individual life. This is one of the deepest services that creation stories have always provided to human communities. They make suffering meaningful. If the world was created through a cosmic battle, or through divine sacrifice, or through a process of divine labour, then the difficulty of existence is not a sign that the universe is broken, or that life has gone wrong. It is a reflection of the nature of things, a nature that was established at the very beginning, and that has its own coherence and purpose. The need for identity. Another powerful need that creation stories address is the need for identity, for a clear and coherent answer to the question of who we are and where we belong. Creation stories almost always say something about where human beings came from, whether they were made from clay by a god, or from trees by wandering deities, or from the tears of a creator's eyes, or from the blood of a defeated enemy, or from a cosmic egg. And in saying where we came from, they tell us what we are. They establish our relationship to the divine, our relationship to nature, our place in the cosmic hierarchy. Consider how much depends on this. In the Abrahamic traditions, human beings are created in the image of God, imago Dei, as the Latin theological tradition put it. This single idea has had consequences that are almost impossible to overstate. If every human being is made in the image of the divine, then every human being carries a fundamental dignity that cannot be taken away by any earthly power. This idea is the philosophical foundation of human rights, the conviction that there is something in every person that must be respected, not because of their social status or their usefulness or their beauty, but because of what they are in their deepest nature. Contrast this with cosmogonies in which humans are created as servants or slaves, made to labour for the gods, to do the tedious work that the divine beings found beneath them. This is not simply a different theological claim, it is a different political reality. A society that believes humans were made to serve the gods will organise itself very differently from a society that believes humans were made in the divine image. Creation stories are not merely answers to abstract questions, they are blueprints for civilization. The wonder at the heart of everything. But not all of this is about fear and need and defence. There is another dimension to the human impulse to ask about origins, one that is quieter, more luminous, and perhaps more fundamental than any of the others. It is simply wonder. There is something in the human mind that responds to the sheer improbability and strangeness of existence with a feeling that can only be called awe. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. It contains, by current estimates, somewhere between 100 billion and 2 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars. Around many of those stars orbit planets, and on at least one of those planets, our own, something that can be called life arose, and over billions of years became more and more complex, until eventually it produced creatures who could look up at the sky above their heads and recognize and marvel at the incomprehensible scale of what they were looking at. This is not nothing. This is extraordinary. And the impulse to ask how it all began is, in part, simply an expression of that marvel. We want to understand the origin because the existence is so astonishing that it demands an explanation commensurate with its magnificence. A universe this vast and this intricate and this ancient cannot simply have always been here. It must have a story. And we want to know that story not only because we are afraid of randomness or in need of identity, but because we are at some level genuinely enchanted by the fact that we exist at all. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, writing in the 17th century, formulated the question with elegant precision. Why is there something rather than nothing? This is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical one, perhaps the philosophical question, and what makes it so powerful is not the difficulty of the answer, but the difficulty of asking it properly. Because in order to ask the question, you have to first feel the strangeness of existence. You have to be struck, genuinely struck, by the fact that you are here, that the world is here, that anything at all is here rather than just the silence and emptiness of the nothing that was presumably the default. And that feeling of being struck, that sudden vertiginous sense that existence is the most astonishing thing in the world, is one of the most profoundly human experiences there is. For most of human history, creation stories were told within a framework of the sacred. The stories were not mere explanations, they were revelations. The world began as it did because the gods willed it so, and the gods communicated this to the priests and prophets and visionaries who then transmitted it to the community. The story was authoritative because it came from a divine source. To question the story was not merely impolite. In many cultures and times it was a potentially fatal act of sacrilege. And then, in several places around the world, with particular intensity and historical consequence in ancient Greece, in India and in China, something began to change. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, incrementally, across several generations of increasingly daring thinkers, a new approach to the question of origins began to emerge, an approach that said, perhaps we do not need the gods to explain the world. Perhaps the world can explain itself. Perhaps if we look carefully enough at nature, at the patterns of the sky, the behaviour of water, the properties of earth and fire and air, we can understand how it works without reference to divine will. This was not atheism in most cases. The early philosophers were not, for the most part, denying the existence of the gods. They were doing something subtler and in some ways more radical. They were proposing that the gods, or something behind the gods, something more fundamental than the gods, operated according to principles that human reason could in principle discover. The cosmos had a logos, a rational structure, and that structure was accessible to the human mind. Thales and the first scientific question. The story is traditionally told beginning with Thales of Miletus, a Greek philosopher who lived in the late 7th and early 6th century before the Common Era. Thales is often called the first philosopher, a title that, like all such firsts, is somewhat arbitrary, since his ideas did not emerge from nowhere. But the tradition is not wrong to single him out, because what he did was genuinely new in the context of the Greek world he inhabited. Thales asked, "What is the world made of? What is the primary substance, the arche, as the Greeks would call it, from which everything else derives?" And his answer, water, sounds at first like a step backward, a return to the Babylonian and Egyptian cosmogonies we have already explored. But the form of the question was completely different. Thales was not saying that water was the beginning because a god had made it the beginning, or because a sacred tradition revealed it to be so. He was saying that water was the primary substance because of observations, because water was found everywhere, because it could exist in 3 states, solid, liquid, gas, because living things all seemed to require it, because he had seen the land rise from the sea in various places. He was reasoning from evidence. This was the new thing, not the answer, but the method. The willingness to ask not just what happened at the beginning, but what the underlying substance and principle of the world might be, and to look for the answer in the world itself rather than in a revealed narrative. After Thales came Anaximander, his student, who took the project even further. Anaximander was not satisfied with any familiar element, not water, not fire, not earth, not air, as the primary substance. He proposed instead something he called the apeiron, the boundless, the indefinite, the infinite. The primary substance was not anything we could see or touch or taste. It was something underlying all the observable elements, something from which they all emerged through a process of separation and opposition. This is a breathtakingly abstract idea for the 6th century BCE, the notion that the fundamental nature of reality is something that exceeds our direct sensory experience, something that can only be approached through thought. Anaximenes, another Milesian philosopher, proposed air as the primary substance, but more importantly, he proposed a specific mechanism by which air became everything else, through condensation and rarefaction. When air condensed, it became water, then earth, then stone. When it rarefied, it became fire. Here was a cosmogony that was not just speculative but process-based, an attempt to explain not just what the world was made of but how the transformation happened, through what mechanism one thing became another. Heraclitus and the river of change. In the same generation, a philosopher of a different temperament was thinking about origins in a different way. Heraclitus of Ephesus is one of the most fascinating and cryptic figures in all of ancient thought. He wrote in deliberately obscure oracular prose, aphorisms that demanded effort and reward interpretation, and at the centre of his thought was a vision of the world as process rather than substance. You cannot step into the same river twice, Heraclitus said, because new waters are always flowing through it. The river is not the water in it at any given moment. It is the flowing, the process, the pattern that persists through constant change. And this, said Heraclitus, is the nature of all things. Everything is in flux. Everything is constantly changing. The world is not made of any stable substance. It is made of change itself. The primary principle is not water or air or a apeiron. It is fire. because fire is the best image of constant transformation, consuming what it touches and converting it into something new, never the same from one moment to the next. But underlying this constant change, said Heraclitus, there was a logos, a rational principle, a structuring intelligence that governed the transformations and gave the world its coherence. The logos was not a god in the traditional sense. It was more like a law, the law of balance and opposition that ensured that as one thing increased, another decreased, that as day gave way to night, night gave way to day, that opposites were not enemies but complements, and that the tension between them was what kept the world alive. Democritus and the atoms. A little later, in the 5th century BCE, a philosopher named Democritus put forward an idea that would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of human thought, an idea that was largely ignored in his own time, partly forgotten through the medieval centuries, and then recovered and vindicated in the 19th century, when chemistry began to discover the actual atomic structure of matter. Democritus proposed that matter was not infinitely divisible. If you took any substance and divided it in half, and then divided the half in half, and continued this process indefinitely, you would not reach nothing. You would reach something that could not be divided further, a smallest possible unit of matter. He called these units atomos, the uncuttable ones, the indivisibles, atoms, and the world in Democritus's vision was nothing more than atoms and the void, an infinite number of atoms of different sizes and shapes, moving through infinite empty space, colliding and combining and separating to produce everything we see. There were no gods in this picture, or rather, gods themselves were made of atoms. There was no purpose, no meaning, no divine plan. There was only the eternal motion of atoms through the void, governed by necessity, by the mechanical consequences of their collisions. This is a vision of staggering modernity. Democritus lived in the 5th century BCE, but his picture of the world is not so far from what modern physics describes. A universe of particles moving through space, governed by the consequences of their interactions, producing through sheer complexity the illusion of stability and substance. He was wrong in many details. Atoms are not featureless lumps, but extraordinarily complex structures, and the void is not truly empty. But the basic intuition that matter has an irreducible, minimal structure, and that the world's complexity emerges from the interaction of these minimal units, was profoundly right. India's parallel revolutions. While the Greeks were developing their naturalistic cosmologies, something equally remarkable was happening in India. The Upanishads, philosophical texts that grew out of the Vedic tradition, were grappling with questions of origin and substance with extraordinary depth and subtlety. The Chandogya Upanishad, composed perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE, contains a famous dialogue between a teacher named Uddalaka and his son Shvetaketu, in which the teacher attempts to explain the nature of the ultimate reality. In the beginning, my dear, there was only being, one without a second. From that being the entire world was born, that which is the subtle essence. All this has that as its soul. That is the real, that is the self. That art thou, Shvetaketu. Tattavamasi, that art thou. This is one of the great Mahavakyas, the great sayings of the Upanishadic tradition. The self, the innermost awareness of the individual, is identical with the ultimate ground of all being. Atman, the self, is Brahman, the absolute reality. The boundary between the individual and the cosmos is not real. It is a product of ignorance, of the failure to see clearly. When you understand your true nature, you understand the nature of everything, because your true nature and the nature of everything are the same thing. This is not the same project as Greek naturalistic philosophy, but it is addressing the same deep question. What is the ultimate nature of reality, and what is the relationship between the individual and the whole? And the Upanishadic answer, that the self and the cosmos are one, is a solution to the problem of origins that has a different character from both the mythological and the scientific approaches. It says, you're not looking for the origin of the world from the outside. You're the origin of the world. The question and the questioner are the same thing. China's cosmic order. In China, in the same general period, Taoist and Confucian thinkers were developing yet another approach to questions of origin and order. The Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism, attributed to the legendary sage Laozi, and composed perhaps in the 6th or 5th century BCE, opens with a statement that is simultaneously a cosmological claim and a warning about the limits of language. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be given is not the eternal name. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. The Tao, the way, is the underlying principle of all things, the source from which everything flows, the pattern that everything expresses. But it cannot be captured in language or thought, because language and thought are themselves things that arise from the Tao, and a thing cannot fully contain what it arose from. The Tao is prior to all distinctions, prior to the distinction between being and non-being, between light and darkness, between the sacred and the profane. It simply is as the ground of all that is. What is striking about this approach is its epistemic humility, its insistence that the ultimate origin of things exceeds our capacity to describe or even properly think about it. This is not so different from the final verses of the Nasadiya Sukta, or from the apophatic theology of various mystical traditions in the West, or from the physicist's acknowledgement that the universe's origin lies beyond the reach of current theory. There is a recurring human recognition that the beginning, the true beginning, the absolute origin, is precisely the place where our ordinary tools of understanding break down. The story of how science came to address the question of cosmic origins is one of the most extraordinary intellectual adventures in human history. It is a story that unfolds over centuries, involving dozens of countries and hundreds of individual minds, each one building on what came before, each one daring to look a little further into the darkness and report back what they found. It is also, importantly, a human story, full of personality and conflict and error and brilliance and the particular kind of obsessive dedication that drives someone to spend decades studying a single problem that most of their contemporaries consider either unanswerable or irrelevant. The scientists who unraveled the origin of the universe were not robots. They were people with fears and hopes and relationships and moments of despair and moments of transcendence, and their humanity is as much a part of the story as their mathematics. The long journey of astronomy, the scientific quest to understand the origin of the universe, began, really, with the patient accumulation of astronomical knowledge over centuries and millennia. The Babylonians and Egyptians were careful sky watchers who developed sophisticated mathematical tools for tracking the movements of celestial bodies and predicting eclipses and planetary positions. The Greek astronomers, Hipparchus, Eratosthenes, Aristarchus, made measurements and calculations of breathtaking precision, and Aristarchus even proposed in the 3rd century BCE that the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the other way around, a heliocentric model that would not be revived and vindicated for nearly 2,000 years. The Islamic astronomers of the medieval period, al-Battani, al-Biruni, Ibn al-Haytham, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, made refinements to Greek astronomical models that were indispensable to the later Copernican revolution. Without the Islamic preservation and elaboration of classical knowledge through the European Dark Ages, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries could not have happened when and as it did. Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish canon who published his heliocentric model in 1543, legend has it that he received the first printed copy of his De Revolutionibus on his deathbed, set in motion a transformation in humanity's understanding of its place in the universe that is still reverberating. The Earth was not the centre. The Sun was the centre, or rather, as later astronomers would determine, our solar system was one tiny corner of one ordinary galaxy among billions. The demotion was vertiginous. The universe was not made for us. We occupied no privileged position in it. Johannes Kepler, working with the extraordinary observational data of Tycho Brahe, showed in the early 17th century that planets moved not in perfect circles, as the Greeks had assumed, because the circle was the perfect form, but in ellipses. This was more than an astronomical detail. It was a philosophical statement. Nature did not conform to our ideals of perfection. It had its own geometry, and we had to discover what that geometry actually was rather than imposing our preconceptions upon it. Isaac Newton, in 1687, published his Principia Mathematica and gave the world a unified account of motion, on earth and in the heavens, governed by a single set of mathematical laws. An apple fell from a tree by the same force that kept the moon in its orbit. Gravity was universal, mathematical, and comprehensible. The cosmos operated like an enormously complex machine, but a machine whose rules could in principle be fully understood. The clockwork universe was born, and it was magnificent, and it had implications for the question of origins that Newton himself was not entirely comfortable with. If the universe operated by laws, who had set those laws? Who had wound the clock? The age of the earth. A revolution in deep time. For most of Christian European history, the question of when the universe began had a specific answer. In 4004 BCE, as calculated by Archbishop James Usher of Armagh in the 17th century, using the genealogies of the Old Testament, the universe was approximately 6,000 years old. This was not lunacy. It was a sincere and systematic attempt to use the best available text-based evidence to answer the historical question of origins. But it was wrong, by a factor of almost 1 million. The revolution in understanding the age of the Earth came gradually, through the patient work of geologists in the 18th and 19th centuries. James Hutton, a Scottish physician and farmer who became one of the founders of modern geology, proposed in his theory of the Earth in 1788 what he called the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the geological processes we observe happening today, erosion, deposition, volcanic activity, had been operating throughout all of Earth's history, and that by studying the rates of these processes and the thicknesses of the rock layers they produced, we could begin to estimate how long the Earth had existed. Hutton looked at the layered sedimentary rocks of Scotland and concluded that they had been formed over vast stretches of time, far longer than any religious chronology allowed. He famously wrote that the geological record showed no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. The Earth was old beyond comprehension. We now know it is approximately 4.5 billion years old. In Hutton's time, even 100 million years was an almost inconceivable number. The adjustment from 6,000 to billions was one of the most disorienting intellectual expansions in human history. Charles Lyell elaborated Hutton's uniformitarianism into a comprehensive geological theory in his Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833. This was the book that a young Charles Darwin took with him on the voyage of the Beagle, and it was the geological framework of deep time that made Darwin's theory of evolution possible. You cannot evolve complex life from simple organisms through the accumulation of small changes unless you have an enormous amount of time for those changes to accumulate. Deep time was the canvas on which evolution could be painted. Darwin and the Origin of Species. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, is often described as one of the most important books ever written, and the description is not hyperbole. What Darwin proposed, that the astonishing diversity of life on Earth had arisen not through divine creation, but through the process of natural selection, acting on heritable variation over vast spans of geological time, was a direct assault on the most intimate and personal aspect of the creation question, the origin of human beings themselves. Darwin himself was cautious in The Origin. He barely mentioned human beings, leaving the implications to be worked out by others and by his later work, The Descent of Man. But everyone who read the book understood immediately what it implied. If all species had descended with modification from common ancestors, then human beings had descended with modification from earlier primate ancestors. We shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzee. We were, in the most literal biological sense, related to every living thing on Earth. This was not merely a scientific claim. It was a creation story. The most radical alternative creation story that had ever been proposed, because it was not a story at all in the traditional sense. It did not have a creator. It did not have a purpose. It did not say that we are here for any reason other than the accumulation of fortunate accidents and successful adaptations over billions of years. The emotional impact of this vision cannot be overstated. For many people, it felt like a bereavement, the loss of a special place in the cosmic order, the loss of the certainty that life had meaning and direction, and that we had been placed here by a power that cared about us. For others, and this group has grown with every generation since 1859, the Darwinian picture was not diminishing but enlarging. To be the product of 4 billion years of evolution, to carry in your body the history of every organism that ever lived, to be genuinely, biochemically related to every other living thing on Earth, this was not a cause for despair, but for wonder. The question of origins had acquired a new and astonishing answer, and the answer was more complex and more beautiful than anything the old stories had imagined. The expanding universe, Einstein, Hubble, and the Big Bang. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the question of the origin of the universe itself, not just life or the Earth, but the cosmos as a whole, was about to receive its most dramatic and surprising answer yet. Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity in 1915, and among its many consequences was a prediction that disturbed Einstein himself. The equation suggested that the universe was not static. It was either expanding or contracting. Einstein, who like most scientists of his time assumed the universe was eternal and unchanging on the larger scales, introduced what he called the cosmological constant, a fudge factor that he added to his equations to keep the universe still. It was, he later said, the greatest mistake of his life. In 1927, the Belgian priest and physicist Georges Lemaitre, a remarkable figure who saw no contradiction between his Catholic faith and his scientific work, derived from Einstein's equations the conclusion that the universe was expanding. And he went further. If the universe was expanding now, then in the past it had been smaller, and if you went far enough back in time, the entire universe had been contained in what he called the primeval atom, a single point of incomprehensible density from which everything had exploded. 2 years later, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble provided the observational confirmation. Using the new 100-inch Hooker telescope at Mount Wilson Observatory in California, Hubble measured the velocities of distant galaxies and showed that they were moving away from us, and that the further away they were, the faster they were receding. The universe was expanding in all directions uniformly. Lemaitre was right. The idea of a universe beginning from a single point was initially derided by the British astronomer Fred Hoyle, who called it sarcastically the Big Bang, and the name stuck to Hoyle's lasting irritation, even though Hoyle himself favoured a steady-state model in which the universe had no beginning and no end. The discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965, the faint echo of the primordial heat, still detectable in every direction of the sky, effectively settled the debate. The universe had a beginning. Approximately 13.8 billion years ago, something that we call the Big Bang occurred, and from that singular, unimaginably hot, unimaginably dense initial state, everything expanded and cooled and structured itself over billions of years into the cosmos we inhabit. The Big Bang is not a perfect creation story. It is not a story at all, in the narrative sense. It is a scientific model, a mathematical description of the universe's earliest moments, increasingly well supported by evidence from multiple independent lines of observation. But it occupies, in our culture, the emotional and psychological space that creation myths have always occupied. It is our answer to the oldest question. It is the beginning of our particular version of the universe's birth story. And like all creation stories before it raises more questions than it answers. What caused the Big Bang? What existed before it? Why did the universe begin in the particular configuration it did? Why do the laws of physics have the values they do? Why is there something rather than nothing? These questions remain as open as they have always been, because science, like myth and philosophy before it, has the power to push the horizon back, but not to eliminate it. We have now travelled through several thousand years of human attempts to understand the origin of everything, from the first campfire stories to the cosmic microwave background, and we have encountered, along the way, a tension that has shaped much of Western intellectual history and continues to shape our culture today. The tension between the mythological and scientific approaches to the question of origins. This tension is real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. There are genuine conflicts between some creation stories, particularly those that make specific empirical claims about the age of the Earth, the mechanism of human creation, or the sequence of events at the beginning of time, and the findings of modern science. When a religious text says the Earth was created in 6 days 6,000 years ago, and geology shows that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, these two claims cannot both be literally true. The conflict is real. But much of the apparent conflict between myth and science dissolves when we are clearer about what each is actually doing. Science is a method for generating knowledge about the physical world, a method that relies on observation, measurement, hypothesis, and testing, and that has a built-in mechanism for correcting its own errors. It is extraordinarily good at answering certain kinds of questions. What is the universe made of? How old is it? How did life arise? How do species change over time? These are empirical questions, and empirical questions are what science was designed to address. Myths, and more broadly, the religious and philosophical frameworks within which creation stories are embedded, are doing something different. They are not at their best competing scientific theories. They are responses to a different set of questions. What does my existence mean? How should I live? What do I owe to the world and to other people? What is the nature of the sacred? How should I face death? What is the proper relationship between human beings and the rest of nature? These are not empirical questions. They are not the kind of questions that a telescope or a particle accelerator can answer. The scientist and the storyteller, the physicist and the priest, are often reaching for different things with the same extended hand. The mistake, on both sides, is to insist that only one hand is legitimate. The theologian who insists that the creation account in Genesis is a more accurate description of cosmic history then the Big Bang model is making a category error, using a text designed to convey meaning as if it were a scientific treatise. The scientist who insists that the Big Bang model makes questions of meaning and purpose and the sacred entirely irrelevant is making a different but equally serious category error, using a physical theory as if it were a complete description of human experience. The richest and most honest thinkers in both traditions have always understood this. Georges Lemaire, who proposed the Big Bang, was also a Catholic priest. He explicitly insisted that his scientific theory had no bearing on questions of religious faith, not because he was being evasive, but because he understood clearly that science and faith were asking different questions. The geneticist Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project and is also a devout Christian, has written extensively about how he holds both identities without inner conflict, not by compromising one for the other, but by recognizing that they occupy different spaces in his life and his understanding. The genuine conflict is not between science and religion per se, but between scientific thinking and certain specific claims made by certain specific religious traditions at certain specific historical moments, and that conflict, while real and sometimes deeply painful, is in many ways a sign of intellectual health, of a culture willing to ask hard questions and to update its understanding when the evidence demands it. What is perhaps most remarkable, looking at the long sweep of human history, is not the conflicts but the continuity. The impulse that drove the priests of Babylon to record the Enuma Elish on clay tablets is recognizably the same impulse that drove Georges Lemaitre to work out the mathematics of an expanding universe. The wonder is the same. The need to understand is the same. The reaching toward the beginning, toward the first moment, the primal cause, the ultimate origin, is the same. We have changed our methods, our vocabulary, our precision, and the scope of what we know. But the human being doing the reaching is unchanged. We are still, at the core, the same people who gathered around the fire and looked up at the stars and felt the question press against the inside of our chest like something trying to get out. We have covered the broad outlines of the human quest to understand origins, the great creation myths, the psychological needs they address, the philosophical turn toward reason, and the scientific revolution that gave us the Big Bang and evolution. But this is a story with 1,000 chapters, and we have only read a few of them. In what follows, we will wander more freely through the landscape of this ancient and enduring human project, pausing at stories and figures and discoveries and debates that illuminate different facets of the same great question. The Zuni and the Emergence, a Native American vision. Among the Zuni people of what is now the American Southwest, the creation story speaks of a world that began in darkness deep underground. The first people lived in a series of underworlds, each one slightly closer to the surface than the last, each one a stage in a long journey upward. In the deepest world there was no light and no space. The people were crowded together in the dark, pressing against each other, without air enough to breathe properly. They did not yet know what they were or what the world could be. Through the help of the Sun Father and through their own efforts, guided by the twin sons of the sun, the people moved upward through each successive underworld, emerging finally through a hole in the earth's surface into the light of the upper world. This moment of emergence, the moment when the people came up from the underground into the sunlight for the first time, was the moment of true creation. Not creation from nothing, but creation through emergence, through a long and difficult journey from darkness to light, from confinement to space, from unconsciousness to awareness. The Hopi people tell a similar story, as do the Navajo and many other indigenous peoples of the Americas. The emergence motif, the world beginning with a journey upward from beneath the surface, is one of the most distinctive and evocative creation images in human culture. It resonates, perhaps, because it mirrors something in human experience. The emergence from the womb into the light, the emergence from sleep into waking consciousness, the emergence from ignorance into understanding. The physical geography of emergence, the kiva, the sacred underground chamber in Puebla culture, with its sipapu, the small hole in the floor that represents the point of emergence, is a living architecture of creation myth, a space designed to be inhabited by the story. Pangu and the egg, the Chinese story of creation. In ancient Chinese mythology, the universe began as a cosmic egg, a great darkness in which everything that would ever exist was gathered in a formless unity. Inside this egg, a primordial being named Pangu slept and grew for 18,000 years. When he finally awoke, he cracked open the egg and everything began to separate. The light, clear elements, yang, rose upward to form the sky. The heavy, dark elements, yin, sank downward to form the earth. And Pangu himself stood between them, growing taller every day, pushing the sky higher and higher above the earth. For 18,000 more years, Pangu stood between sky and earth, holding them apart, and then he died. And from his death came the world as we know it. His breath became the wind, his voice became the thunder, his left eye became the sun, his right eye the moon. His hair and beard became the stars and the Milky Way. His limbs became the 4 mountains at the corners of the world. His blood became the rivers. His skin and the fine hairs on his body became the trees and the grass and the flowers. His teeth and bones became the metals and the precious stones. His sweat became the rain. The Pangu story is a creation through sacrifice. The death of the primal being is the precondition for the world's existence. This theme appears in many traditions. The Norse Ymir, whose body becomes the world, the Vedic Purusha, the cosmic man whose sacrifice at the hands of the gods produces the social and natural order. Even, in certain interpretations, the Christian Christ, whose death is understood as a cosmic act of redemptive creation. The world costs something. The world requires the dissolution of a prior unity. To have a world, something must give itself up. There is, in this ancient intuition, an echo of something that modern physics has also discovered, that complexity requires the sacrifice of simplicity. The structured, differentiated universe we inhabit came at the cost of the perfect symmetry of the earliest moments after the Big Bang, when all the fundamental forces were unified and all matter existed in a single undifferentiated state. The world as we know it is the result of that symmetry breaking. Something undifferentiated and whole became differentiated and complex. The primal unity gave itself up to make the world. Anaximander's infinite. The first cosmologist. Let us return to Anaximander for a moment, because he deserves more attention than we gave him earlier. Anaximander of Miletus, who lived approximately 610 to 546 BCE, was not only a philosopher but something very close to what we would today call a cosmologist. He drew, as far as we know, the first map of the known world. He proposed that the Earth was cylindrical and hung freely in space without any support, a remarkable intuition, since the prevailing view held that the Earth floated on water or rested on pillars. He proposed that the sun, moon and stars were not what they appeared to be, not luminous bodies, but rings of fire partially concealed by opaque material, visible only through holes in that material. And he proposed that human beings had evolved. That word is anachronistic, but the idea is genuinely present, from fish, or fish-like creatures, because human infants require such extended care that if the first humans had been born as helpless as they are now, they could not have survived. Therefore, he reasoned, the first humans must have been born inside some other species that could care for them, emerging only when they were capable of independent life. This is not evolution in the Darwinian sense. Anaximander did not propose natural selection or common descent through gradual change, but the intuition that humans had origins in earlier, simpler forms of life, and that our current biological situation requires an explanation in terms of our history is strikingly prescient. Anaximander also proposed something that anticipates, in a very rough way, one of the most important concepts in modern thermodynamics and cosmology: the idea that the physical world operates according to a principle of cosmic justice. Things that become excessive, too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet, are brought back to balance by the workings of the apeiron. This is not too far from the physicist's understanding of entropy and equilibrium, or from the cosmologist's observation that the universe tends toward a maximization of disorder over time. Anaximander saw in nature not chaos but a self-regulating system, operating according to principles that could in principle be understood. Giordano Bruno and the Infinite Worlds. In the late 16th century, a Dominican friar from Naples named Giordano Bruno pushed the Copernican revolution to its most extreme logical conclusion, and paid for it with his life. Bruno took the Copernican model of a heliocentric solar system and asked, if the Earth is not the centre of the universe, and the Sun is the centre only of our solar system, what is the centre of the universe? And he answered, there is no centre. The universe is infinite. Every star in the sky is a sun, and every sun has planets, and some of those planets are inhabited by beings as complex and as conscious as we are. We are not special. We are one world among an infinite number of worlds, in an infinite universe that has no centre, no edge, and no privileged observer. This was not merely cosmologically radical, it was theologically explosive. If the universe was infinite, then God was not the external creator of a finite world, but either identical with the infinite universe itself, pantheism, as it would come to be called, or confronted with the problem of an infinity that would seem to diminish rather than magnify the significance of any particular divine act. Bruno was arrested by the Inquisition in 1593, subjected to 7 years of trial and imprisonment, and burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. He refused to recant any of his positions. Bruno was not a scientist in the modern sense. Many of his ideas were mystical, and derived from Hermetic and Neoplatonic traditions rather than observation and mathematics. But on the specific question of the plurality of worlds and the infinity of the universe, he was right. We now know that the universe contains trillions of stars and billions of galaxies, and that planetary systems are common rather than exceptional. The probability that life exists elsewhere in the universe, that other conscious beings are also looking up at their own version of the night sky and asking their own version of the question of origins, is, to most scientists, extremely high. Bruno died for an idea that is now part of the scientific consensus. His statue stands in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, in the exact spot where he was burned. The Iroquois creation, the world on Turtle's back. Before European contact, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, told a creation story that begins not with the world we know, but with a world above the sky, a land where people lived before the earth existed below. A woman, sometimes called Sky Woman, fell through a hole in the sky world, grasping at the edges as she fell, pulling up roots and soil as she went. Below, there was only water and the creatures that lived in it. The water birds saw her falling and flew up together, catching her on their outstretched wings and lowering her gently. But there was nowhere to set her down, only water. The animals took turns diving to the bottom of the sea to bring up earth, but most failed. Finally, the muskrat dove deep and returned with a tiny clump of mud in its paw, dying from the effort. This mud was placed on the back of the great turtle, and the woman walked on it, and it grew and spread until it became the entire world, which is why the Americas are sometimes called Turtle Island in indigenous tradition. Sky Woman brought with her the seeds she had grasped as she fell, the plants that would feed the people. She gave birth to twins who were different in nature, one creative and generous, one competitive and more difficult. The twins shaped the world between them, the rivers, the mountains, the animals, the seasons, each one contributing their particular quality to what became the complex, imperfect, deeply beautiful world we inhabit. What strikes me about this story, among many things, is its emphasis on community and interdependence. The world is saved not by a single divine figure acting alone, but by a community of creatures working together. The birds who catch the falling woman, the animals who dive for the earth, the turtle who offers its back. The world is a collective achievement. It is held up by the cooperation of everyone in it. This is a creation story with an implicit ethical teaching. The world requires our care and cooperation to survive. We're all holding it up together. William Herschel and the discovery of deep space. In the late 18th century, a German-born musician who had emigrated to England made a series of telescopic observations that profoundly changed humanity's understanding of the scale of the universe. William Herschel had taught himself astronomy after his career as a musician and composer in Bath, and with telescopes of his own construction, including one that was, at the time, the largest in the world, he began systematically surveying the sky. Herschel discovered Uranus in 1781, the first planet to be discovered since antiquity. But his more important contribution was his work on nebulae, the faint fuzzy patches of light scattered across the sky that were clearly not individual stars. Herschel catalogued thousands of these nebulae and tried to understand what they were. He proposed that some of them were distant star systems, what we would now call galaxies, so far away that their individual stars could not be resolved by any telescope then available. He was right, though he could not prove it with the tools he had. The debate about the nature of nebulae, whether they were clouds of gas within our own Milky Way galaxy, or whether they were separate distant galaxies in their own right, continued through the 19th century and into the 20th. It was resolved definitively in the 1920s by Edwin Hubble, who measured the distance to the Andromeda Nebula using a type of variable star called a Cepheid, and showed that it was far too distant to be part of the Milky Way. Andromeda was a separate galaxy, approximately 2 million light-years away, and the universe suddenly expanded in human imagination from a single galaxy to something containing billions of them. 2 million light-years. Light, the fastest thing in the universe, travelling at 300,000 kilometers per second, takes 2 million years to make that journey. The Andromeda Galaxy's light that Hubble observed with his telescope had left its source 2 million years before it arrived at his eye. He was looking not just into space, but into the past. 2 million years into the past. And Andromeda is our nearest large galactic neighbour. The most distant objects visible with modern telescopes are more than 13 billion light-years away. When we look at them, we're seeing the universe as it was when it was less than 1 billion years old. Every time we look at the night sky, we're looking into the past. Every star we see is seen not as it is now, but as it was. Years, centuries, millennia, millions of years ago. The night sky is a time machine, and it is available to anyone who cares to look up. This is one of the most vertiginous and beautiful facts about the universe we inhabit. The cosmic microwave background, listening to the echo of the beginning. In 1964, 2 American radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, were working at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey, attempting to eliminate a persistent noise from their radio antenna. They cleaned the antenna, checked their equipment, and even removed a family of pigeons that had made their home in the horn-shaped device. But the noise persisted. It came from every direction, equally, at all times, a faint, constant hiss of microwave radiation. What Penzias and Wilson had accidentally discovered was the cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang itself. When the universe was approximately 380,000 years old, it had cooled enough for hydrogen atoms to form, and the universe became transparent to light for the first time. The light that was released at that moment, the light of the early universe becoming transparent, has been travelling through space ever since, cooling and red-shifting as the universe expanded, until today it pervades all of space as microwave radiation at a temperature of approximately 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. Penzias and Wilson won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1978 for this discovery, and the cosmic microwave background has since been mapped with extraordinary precision by satellites including COBE, WMAP, and Planck, revealing tiny temperature fluctuations, ripples in the primordial sea, that represent the seeds of all the structure we see in the universe today. The galaxies, the galaxy clusters, the great filaments and voids of the cosmic web, all of them grew from those tiny temperature fluctuations in the first moments of the universe's existence. We are, in other words, listening to the oldest sound in the universe. The cosmic microwave background is the universe's birth cry, still faintly echoing across all of space 13.5 billion years later. And the structure of those echoes tells us, with a precision that would have seemed impossible to any earlier generation, what the universe looked like at its very beginning. Polynesian navigation and the stars. Another way of knowing the sky. The relationship between human beings and the stars is not purely a matter of abstract cosmological curiosity. For thousands of years, across many cultures, the sky was also a practical tool, a navigational aid, a calendar, a way of organising time and space and the rhythms of life. Nowhere was this more true, or more impressive, than in the Pacific. The Polynesian people who settled the vast triangle of ocean between Hawaii, New Zealand and Easter Island, a maritime domain larger than the total land area of all the world's continents combined, navigated without compasses, without charts, without any of the instruments that European sailors depended on for thousands of years after their origins. They navigated by the stars, by the swell patterns of the ocean, by the behaviour of birds and clouds and the colour of the water. They memorised star paths, the rising and setting positions of hundreds of individual stars throughout the year, and used them to steer their double-hulled canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean with extraordinary precision. And the same stars that were their navigational tools were also the characters in their creation stories. The Pleiades, known in Hawaiian as Makali'i, marked the beginning of the new year and the start of the navigation season. Arcturus, Hokulea in Hawaiian, the star of joy, was the zenith star that told Polynesian navigators when they had reached the latitude of Hawaii. The creation stories and the navigational knowledge were the same knowledge, encoded in the same sky, serving both the spiritual and the practical needs of the community. This integration of the sacred and the practical, the mythological and the navigational, is a reminder that for most of human history, there was no clean separation between the question of origins and the question of how to live and move in the world. The sky was not just a philosophical puzzle. It was a living presence, a source of guidance and meaning, a text that the community read every night with the same attention and care that later cultures would bring to their sacred books. Al-Biruni and the Islamic Golden Age of Cosmic Inquiry. In the early 11th century, a scholar working in the court of the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni produced one of the most remarkable works of comparative cultural scholarship in human history. Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, known to later scholars simply as al-Biruni, was a polymath of astonishing breadth and depth. Mathematician, astronomer, geographer, historian, pharmacologist, and ethnographer. He learned Sanskrit specifically in order to study Indian philosophy and science, and he wrote a comprehensive account of Indian culture, Kitab fi Tahqiq Malil Hind, that remains invaluable to scholars today. Al-Biruni was particularly interested in how different cultures understood the origin and structure of the universe, and his approach was distinctively modern in its respect for the traditions he studied. He did not dismiss Hindu or Buddhist cosmology as mere superstition. He engaged with it seriously, compared it to Greek and Islamic cosmological thinking, and noted where the traditions agreed and where they differed. He was one of the first scholars in history to approach the diversity of human belief about origins with something like genuine scholarly neutrality. Al-Biruni also made contributions to empirical astronomy of lasting value. He developed a method for determining the radius of the Earth from a single observation from a mountaintop, a method that gave a result remarkably close to the correct value. He proposed that the Sun was at the centre of the solar system centuries before Copernicus, and he speculated that the land masses of the Earth had once been different from how they were in his time, an intuition that would not be verified until the development of plate tectonics in the 20th century. Al-Biruni lived at the peak of the Islamic Golden Age, a period roughly from the 8th through the 13th centuries in which the Islamic world was the primary custodian and developer of scientific and philosophical knowledge. Islamic scholars translated the works of Greek philosophy and science, preserving and elaborating them during the period when much of this knowledge was inaccessible in Christian Europe. The contributions of Islamic scholars to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy were foundational to the later European Renaissance and scientific revolution. The story of how we came to understand the origin of the universe is not a Western story alone. It is a genuinely global story in which the Islamic world played a central and indispensable role. The first 3 minutes, recreating the early universe. In 1977, the physicist Steven Weinberg published a book called The First 3 Minutes, which gave general readers the most detailed and accessible account yet written of what physics had managed to understand about the earliest moments of the universe. The title is almost comically specific, 3 minutes, but the precision is the point. Physics had reached a stage where it was possible to describe, in mathematical detail, what the universe looked like in the first few minutes of its existence. In the first fraction of a second, the first 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds to be precise, a span of time so small it makes the nanosecond look like an eternity. The universe was a state of almost infinite temperature and density in which the 4 fundamental forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, were all unified into a single force. We do not yet have a theory that can fully describe this moment, because it requires a unified theory of quantum mechanics and gravity that we do not yet possess. In the first microsecond, quarks and gluons began to combine into protons and neutrons. In the first second, the universe had cooled enough for these particles to exist in a stable form. In the first 3 minutes, the temperature had dropped enough for protons and neutrons to combine into atomic nuclei, mostly hydrogen and helium, with traces of lithium. This is the process called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, and it is one of the most powerful confirmations of the Big Bang model, because the predicted ratio of hydrogen to helium, approximately 3:1 by mass, matches with extraordinary precision what we actually observe in the oldest, most pristine parts of the universe. For 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe remained a hot, opaque plasma, too hot for electrons to bind to nuclei and form neutral atoms. Then it cooled enough for atoms to form, and the universe became transparent, and the light released at that moment became the cosmic microwave background that Penzias and Wilson would accidentally discover 2 billion years later. The first stars did not form until perhaps 100 million years after the Big Bang, enormous short-lived behemoths that burned hot and fast and exploded as supernovae, seeding the universe with the heavier elements that stars cannot make on their own. Carbon, oxygen, iron, the atoms of your body. Every atom heavier than hydrogen in your body was forged inside a star. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the oxygen in every breath you take, all of it was synthesized in stellar furnaces that burned and died before our sun was born. You are, in a very literal and not merely poetic sense, made of stars. The nuclear physicist Harlow Shapley once wrote that we are brothers of the boulders, cousins of the clouds, and the astrophysicist Carl Sagan said it more memorably still. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. The anthropic principle and the fine-tuned universe. In the 1970s and 1980s, physicists began noticing something puzzling and profound about the fundamental constants of nature. The numbers that determine how strong gravity is, how massive an electron is, how fast light travels, how the strong nuclear force behaves. These numbers, it turned out, were extraordinarily precisely calibrated for the existence of complex structured matter. If the gravitational constant were even slightly larger, stars would burn too fast and too hot for life to develop. If the electromagnetic force was slightly weaker, atoms could not form. If the strong nuclear force was slightly different, carbon, the basis of life as we know it, would not exist. The universe, in other words, appeared to be tuned, set to precisely the values that would allow the development of complex chemistry, planets, stars that burn for billions of years, and eventually life. This was called the fine-tuning problem, and it generated one of the most vigorous and productive philosophical debates in modern physics. One response to the fine-tuning problem is to say that it confirms the existence of a creator, that the universe appears designed because it was designed, and that the constants were set by a divine intelligence precisely because it wanted the universe to produce life and consciousness. This is essentially a modern form of the argument from design that has been made by theologians for centuries. A different response, one that has gained increasing acceptance among physicists, is the multiverse hypothesis. If our universe is only one of an enormous or infinite number of universes, each with different values of the fundamental constants, then it is not surprising that we find ourselves in a universe with the right values for life. We could not exist in any other kind of universe, so by definition, we can only observe and report on a universe that allows our existence. The fact that our universe is life-permitting is no more mysterious than the fact that we live on a planet that can support life, not because the planet was designed for us, but because we could not be here to observe any other kind of planet. The multiverse hypothesis remains speculative and controversial. It may be permanently untestable. If other universes exist, they may be in principle inaccessible to any kind of observation or experiment. And some physicists and philosophers argue that an untestable hypothesis is not truly scientific in the meaningful sense. But it represents a remarkable extension of the same move that Copernicus made, from thinking that our position is uniquely privileged to recognizing that we may be one instance among many, from one world to many worlds, from one galaxy to billions, from one universe to, perhaps, an infinite sea of them. Creation stories and social structure. The politics of the beginning. We touched earlier on the idea that creation stories are also political documents, that they explain not just how the world came to be, but why it is organized as it is now. Let us explore this dimension more fully, because it is one of the most important and least appreciated aspects of the genre. Consider the Hindu caste system, which for thousands of years organized Indian society into a rigid hierarchy of priestly Brahmins, warrior kshatriyas, merchant vaishyas, and servant shudras, with various groups considered outside the system entirely. The justification for this system was given in the Rigveda's Purusha Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic man, which described the four varnas as arising from different parts of the body of the sacrificed cosmic being: the Brahmins from the mouth, the Kshatriyas from the arms, the Vaishyas from the thighs, the Shudras from the feet. The social hierarchy was written into the act of creation itself. To question it was to question the order of the universe, or consider the ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order that was established at the moment of creation and maintained by the pharaoh's ritual actions. Ma'at was both a cosmological claim, the universe is ordered and structured, and a political one. The pharaoh's authority is what maintains that order, and therefore his authority is sacred and non-negotiable. The creation story was the foundation on which the entire social and political edifice rested. Change the creation story, and you challenge the entire structure. This explains why creation stories have so often been the site of intense controversy when new ideas about origins emerge. The Darwinian revolution was not merely intellectually challenging, it was socially and politically disruptive. If human beings were not specially created in the divine image, but were instead the product of the same impersonal natural processes that produced every other species, then the claims of religious institutions to special authority over human life were weakened. If there was no designer, there might be no design. And if there was no design, the existing social order had one fewer cosmic justification. Not all creation stories have been used to maintain the status quo. Some have been tools of liberation. The Exodus story, the account of the Israelites' liberation from slavery in Egypt, is not, strictly speaking, a cosmogony. But it is a story about a beginning, the beginning of the Israelite people as a free nation, born from the experience of liberation. And this story has been used for centuries by oppressed people who identified with the enslaved Israelites, and found in the Exodus narrative a theological justification for resistance and freedom. The African American Church's use of Exodus imagery during the centuries of slavery is one of the most powerful and moving examples of a creation story, a story about beginnings, being used not to justify power, but to challenge it. The role of women in creation, a story often untold. In most of the creation stories we've discussed, these central creative figures are male. God, Brahma, Marduk, Odin, the great creators of the world's major religious traditions, are predominantly masculine, and this is not an accident. The stories were largely composed and preserved by male religious authorities in patriarchal societies, and they reflect the gender assumptions of those societies. But this is not the whole picture. Many of the oldest creation images and figures in human history are feminine. The great goddess, the Earth Mother, the birth giver, the primal female power who generates all life from herself, is one of the oldest religious images we have. Figurines of large-bellied, wide-hipped female figures date back tens of thousands of years, and they are found across a remarkable geographic range, from the Venus of Willendorf in Austria to the Venuses of the Russian plain to figurines from across the ancient Near East. These figures almost certainly represent a religious tradition in which the feminine principle was central to the understanding of origin and creation. In Mesopotamia, before the Babylonian period that produced the Enuma Elish, the great mother goddess Ninhursag was one of the most important deities, the creator of human beings from clay, the source of life and fertility and care. In Egypt, Isis was not merely the wife and sister of Osiris, but a cosmic power in her own right, a goddess whose wings sheltered the dead, whose tears created the Nile's flood, whose magical power could resurrect the dead. In the Mesoamerican traditions, Quatlicu, she of the skirt of serpents, was the earth goddess who gave birth to the moon, the stars, and the god Huitzilopochtli, and the Mayan Ixchel was the goddess of medicine, weaving, and the moon, associated with creation and transformation. The feminist scholars who began in the 1970s to re-examine ancient religion and mythology brought these feminine creation images back to scholarly and popular attention. They argued, sometimes speculatively, sometimes on firmer ground, that the dominance of masculine creation figures in the major world religions reflected a historical suppression of earlier goddess traditions, rather than the simple fact of the matter. Whether or not the most dramatic versions of this thesis are correct, the broader point stands. The story of human reflection on origins has a gendered dimension, and that dimension is part of its complexity and its richness. Stephen Hawking and the Question of the Beginning. In 1988, a physicist confined to a wheelchair by the degenerative effects of motor neuron disease published a book about the origin of the universe that sold more than 10 million copies worldwide and introduced the general public to some of the most mind-bending ideas in modern physics. Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time was an extraordinary cultural event, a book about quantum cosmology that sat on bestseller lists for years, read by people who admired it without always fully understanding it, and that fundamentally changed the public conversation about where the universe came from. Hawking's most technically innovative contribution to the question of cosmic origins was his work with the American physicist James Hartle on what they called the no-boundary proposal. In classical physics, the Big Bang represents a singularity, a point at which the laws of physics break down, a genuine beginning beyond which physics cannot reach. The question of what happened before the Big Bang, or what caused it, was therefore unanswerable in principle, not because we didn't know, but because the concepts of before and cause break down at the singularity. Hartley and Hawking proposed that if quantum mechanics was incorporated into the theory of gravity, the singularity might disappear. In quantum cosmology, space and time were not fundamentally different, but were aspects of a single, four-dimensional geometry. And in the no-boundary proposal, this geometry was smooth and closed at the Big Bang, with no singular beginning point and no boundary. The universe would simply be no edge, no beginning in time, no cause in the ordinary sense. The question of what happened before the Big Bang would be like asking what is south of the South Pole. There is no such direction. There is no such time. This proposal has been criticized, developed, and refined in the decades since Hawking and Hartle published it, and it remains controversial within theoretical physics. But it raised, with new precision and new mathematical tools, the same question that has haunted every creation story ever told. Is there a beginning? Does the universe have a first moment? And if it does, what is the status of that first moment? Was it caused by something, or did it simply occur, or is causation itself a concept that breaks down at the origin of time? In his final book, Brief Answers to the Big Questions, published posthumously in 2018, Hawking wrote that spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. This is a bold and controversial claim. Many physicists would argue that spontaneous creation is still creation, and that the question of why there is a quantum vacuum from which universes might spontaneously arise has simply been pushed back rather than answered. But the attempt to answer the oldest question with the newest tools of human understanding is exactly the same project that the author of the Nasadiya Sukta was engaged in, 3,000 years earlier, sitting in a different kind of darkness with different kinds of tools. Both were reaching. Both were honest about the limits of what they knew. Both were asking with everything they had. The Maya and the Long Count. Measuring time by millennia. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica developed what is perhaps the most sophisticated astronomical and calendrical system of the ancient world. Their observations of the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Mars, made without telescopes, using only careful naked-eye observation over centuries, achieved a precision that rivaled anything in the ancient world. And underlying their astronomical knowledge was a concern with time itself that was almost obsessive in its depth and scope. The Maya understood time as cyclical and layered, multiple calendrical cycles running simultaneously, like the interlocking gears of an enormously complex clock. The 260-day Tzolk'in cycle, the 365-day Hab cycle, the Venus cycle of 584 days, the 18,980-day calendar round that aligned all three, and the long count, the great calendar that measured time in units stretching back to what the Maya understood as the beginning of the current world age. The Maya creation story, recorded in the Popol Vuh, a Quiché Maya text from the 16th century that preserves much older oral tradition, describes multiple previous worlds that were created and destroyed before the current one. The gods made human beings from wood in one previous world, but the wooden people were stiff and thoughtless, and they were destroyed by a flood. The current world, the age of humans, began when the gods finally succeeded in making people from corn, the sacred plant, and breathed into them the intelligence and the ability to give thanks to their creators. The Popol Vuh is one of the most beautiful creation texts in world literature, rich with imagery, with the voices of the gods debating and questioning and trying again, with the stories of the hero twins who defeated the lords of the underworld and ascended to become the sun and the moon. It is a story of iteration and experiment. The world as we know it was not the first attempt, and it may not be the last. The gods are not omniscient perfectionists, but striving, questioning, sometimes failing makers, not unlike the human beings who built this civilization beneath the same endlessly cycling sky. Dark matter and dark energy. The universe. We cannot see. One of the most humbling discoveries of modern cosmology is that the ordinary matter, the atoms, the protons and neutrons and electrons, the stars and planets and gas clouds that make up everything we can see and touch and detect, constitutes only about 5% of the total content of the universe. The other 95% is invisible to us. Approximately 27% is what physicists call dark matter, and approximately 68% is dark energy. Dark matter is invisible. It emits no light, reflects no light, absorbs no light. We know it exists only because of its gravitational effects. Galaxies rotate in ways that cannot be explained by the gravity of their visible matter alone. Galaxy clusters bend the light passing through them by more than their visible mass should allow. The large-scale structure of the universe, the way galaxies cluster into filaments and sheets around vast empty voids, matches what computer simulations predict only when dark matter is included. Something is there. We cannot see it. We do not know what it is. Dark energy is even stranger. In 1998, two independent teams of astronomers studying distant supernovae made a discovery that shocked the physics community. The expansion of the universe was not slowing down as gravity would predict, but speeding up. Something was pushing the universe apart, accelerating its expansion. This something, which Einstein's equations could accommodate, and which turned out to be related to the cosmological constant that Einstein had once abandoned, was dubbed dark energy. But the name is a placeholder, not an explanation. We do not know what dark energy is. We do not know why it has the value it does. It is one of the deepest unsolved problems in physics. The discovery that 95% of the universe is invisible and unknown to us is a profound reminder that the scientific story of origins, while incomparably more detailed and precise than any myth, is still very far from complete. We are like people who have studied 5% of a vast library and begun to draw conclusions about the whole. Our conclusions are not wrong, they are supported by compelling evidence, but they are partial. The universe still vastly exceeds our understanding. The horizon is still there, moved back by each discovery but never eliminated. The moment of first light, stars from the Dark Ages. For approximately the first 100 to 200 million years after the Big Bang, the universe was dark. The early stars had not yet formed. The hydrogen and helium produced in the first few minutes were spread through space, slowly cooling and condensing under gravity, drawing together into the first concentrations of matter. The universe was opaque and dark, not the darkness of a night sky with stars beyond, but an absolute uniform darkness with no sources of light anywhere. And then, gradually the first stars began to form. They were enormous by the standards of later stellar generations, some of them hundreds of times more massive than our Sun, because the gas from which they formed had not yet been enriched with the heavy elements produced by stellar nucleosynthesis. These first stars burned ferociously hot and fast, and they died in spectacular supernova explosions that scattered the first heavy elements, carbon, oxygen, silicon, iron, into the surrounding gas. And from that enriched gas, the next generation of stars formed, and then the next, each generation more chemically complex than the last, until eventually, in the outer reaches of a modest spiral galaxy, a cloud of gas and dust collapsed to form our Sun and its planetary system. The moment when the first stars lit up, the end of the cosmic dark ages, is called the epoch of reionization, and it is one of the frontiers of current astronomical observation. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in December 2021 and beginning science operations in 2022, is designed in part to observe the earliest galaxies from this epoch, the first light in the universe, the moment when the long darkness was broken for the first time. Looking at these ancient galaxies, we are looking at the universe in its infancy, at a moment when the story of everything was barely a chapter old. The Akans of West Africa, creation through divine thought. The Akan people of what is now Ghana and Ivory Coast tell a creation story in which the supreme deity, Nyame or Onyankopon, did not create the world through action or struggle or sacrifice, but through thought. The world was conceived in the divine mind before it was externalized into physical existence. Nyame did not struggle with chaos or defeat a monster. He simply thought the world into being, and it was. This idea that the universe originates in mind, in consciousness, in the thinking of a supreme intelligence, runs through many African philosophical traditions and connects to some of the most profound questions in modern physics and philosophy of mind. Is consciousness fundamental? Did the universe begin in something mind-like? Or is consciousness itself a product of the universe, something that emerged late in cosmic history, after billions of years of purely physical processes, and that then turned its attention back on the universe that produced it? These questions are not resolved by modern science. Consciousness remains one of the great mysteries, perhaps the greatest mystery of our time. We know a great deal about the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain states associated with various kinds of experience, but we have no adequate theory of why any physical process, however complex, should give rise to subjective experience, to the feeling of what it is like to be you, reading or listening to these words right now. This is what the philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains as hard as it has ever been. If we cannot explain consciousness from physics, then we cannot fully explain the thing that is asking the question of origins. The questioner, the human mind, is part of the mystery. And in that sense, every creation story is also at some level a story about consciousness, about the mind that wonders and its relationship to the world it wonders about. Kepler's music of the spheres, when beauty guides discovery. Johannes Kepler, who worked in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, was one of the most mathematically gifted astronomers in history, but he was also deeply shaped by a vision of the cosmos that was as much aesthetic and religious as it was scientific. He believed, and this belief guided his work, that the universe was designed according to mathematical principles of beauty and harmony, and that discovering those principles was a form of religious worship. In his Harmonices Mundi, The Harmony of the Worlds, published in 1619, Kepler proposed that the movements of the planets around the Sun followed mathematical ratios that corresponded to the ratios of musical intervals. Each planet had its own musical note, and the changing speeds of the planets as they moved in their elliptical orbits corresponded to the changing notes of a musical chord. The solar system, in Kepler's vision, was a piece of music, an ongoing cosmic symphony inaudible to human ears but accessible to the mathematical mind. Kepler was wrong about the specific details. The harmonic ratios do not hold up under more precise measurement, but he was right about something deeper and more lasting. There is mathematical structure in the universe, and it is of the kind that human beings find beautiful. The elegance of the equations of physics, Einstein's relativity, Maxwell's electromagnetism, Schrödinger's wave equation, is not merely a subjective impression. Physicists consistently find that the most beautiful equations, the ones with the most elegant mathematical structure, tend to be the ones that most accurately describe reality. This is mysterious. Why should the universe be mathematically beautiful? Why should our aesthetic sense, evolved over millions of years on the African savanna for entirely unrelated purposes, be a reliable guide to the deep structure of nature? This is not a question that science can fully answer. It is in some ways the same question that Kepler was asking. Why does the universe have the kind of structure that the human mind finds compelling and beautiful? And the fact that it does, that the equations work, that the mathematics is effective, that the universe seems to speak a language that we can almost understand, is one of the most profound and inexplicable facts about our existence. The discovery of cosmic inflation. In the early 1980s, the American physicist Alan Guth proposed a dramatic modification to the standard Big Bang model that solves several puzzling features of the observable universe. Guth proposed that in the very earliest fraction of a second after the Big Bang, during an interval almost incomprehensibly brief, the universe had undergone a period of exponential expansion called inflation. In this period, the universe expanded by a factor of at least 10 to the power of 26, an expansion so rapid that the distance between two adjacent points grew from less than the size of a proton to larger than a present-day galaxy, all in approximately a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second. Inflation explained several features of the universe that had previously seemed puzzling. Why the cosmic microwave background was so uniform in temperature in all directions, because all the regions we observe were originally in contact with each other before inflation expanded them apart. Why the universe appeared to have a flat geometry, because inflation stretched any initial curvature to negligibility, and why we do not observe certain exotic particles that theories predicted should have been produced in the early universe, because inflation diluted their density to undetectable levels. Inflation also had a startling implication. It could potentially have produced not just our observable universe, but an endless series of universes, a multiverse. In the inflationary scenario, the quantum fluctuations that drove inflation could have produced regions that inflated at different rates, each becoming a separate bubble universe with potentially different physical constants. Our universe would be one bubble in a vast, perhaps infinite, sea of bubbles, each a universe in its own right, most of them inhospitable to life, but collectively containing every possible variation of the physical constants. If inflation is correct, the question of cosmic origins becomes even more bewildering and more wonderful than we had previously imagined. The Big Bang that produced our universe may not have been the first or the only one. There may be right now an endless series of universes being born, each one carrying within it the potential for stars, planets, chemistry, life, and consciousness, each one asking in its own way the same question that we're asking tonight. Origin of life. The most intimate mystery. The question of cosmic origins is vast and abstract. The question of life's origin is more intimate, more personal in some ways, because it concerns us directly. How did the first living thing arise from non-living chemistry? How did the blind processes of physics and chemistry produce on this one small planet at least the extraordinary phenomenon of life, of matter that reproduces, that metabolizes, that evolves? This question, abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-life, is one of the most actively researched areas in modern biology and chemistry, and it remains genuinely unsolved. We have some very good ideas about how life might have originated, and we have been able to recreate in the laboratory some of the steps that might have been involved. But we do not have a complete, experimentally verified account of the path from chemistry to biology. The Miller-Urey experiment of 1952 was a landmark in this quest. Stanley Miller, working under the supervision of Harold Urey at the University of Chicago, took a flask of gases thought to represent the early Earth's atmosphere, methane, ammonia, hydrogen and water vapor, and passed electrical sparks through them to simulate lightning. After a week, he analyzed the contents of the flask and found that it contained amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and therefore of all life as we know it. The fundamental chemistry of life could be produced by ordinary physical processes from simple starting materials. Life, at the chemical level, was not miraculous. It was chemistry. Since the Miller-Urey experiment, researchers have found amino acids in meteorites, in interstellar space, in comets. The basic chemical building blocks of life are not peculiar to Earth. They are scattered throughout the universe, produced by the same processes that produce all the other chemical complexity we observe. Life, if this is right, is not an accident of a single lucky planet, but a product of the universe's general tendency toward chemical complexity. The deeper mystery is how these chemical building blocks assembled themselves into the first self-replicating molecules, the first proto-life. Many researchers now focus on RNA as the most likely candidate for the first self-replicating molecule, because RNA can both carry genetic information, like DNA, and catalyze chemical reactions, like proteins. The RNA world hypothesis proposes that before DNA and protein-based life arose, there was a simpler system based on RNA alone. But how the first RNA molecules arose from simpler chemistry, and how they began to replicate with enough fidelity to evolve, these remain open questions. The multiverse and the question of purpose. If the multiverse is real, if there are an enormous or infinite number of universes, each with different physical constants, each arising from the same inflationary process, then the question of purpose, which has been one of the deepest concerns of every creation story ever told, takes on a new and unsettling character. In a multiverse, our universe need not have been specially designed to produce life and consciousness. It simply happened to be the kind of universe where life and consciousness were possible, and we find ourselves here because we could not exist anywhere else. This is a powerful and logically coherent answer to the fine-tuning problem. But it leaves unanswered, and in some ways makes more acute, the question of purpose. Purpose, in the traditional sense, requires a purposer, a mind that intends something. In the multiverse picture, there is no intentional purpose behind our universe's existence. We are here not because anyone wanted us to be, but because the laws of physics, running randomly through all their possible configurations, eventually produced a configuration that allowed us. We are, in this picture, the product of an enormous cosmic lottery, and we won simply because someone who loses the lottery cannot be here to report the loss. Many people find this deeply unsatisfying, not as a matter of scientific evidence, but as a matter of lived experience. The experience of consciousness, of love, of meaning, of beauty, of moral conviction. These do not feel like the byproducts of a cosmic lottery. They feel like they matter, absolutely and not merely contingently, and this feeling, which is universal, which is found in every culture and every era of human history, is not nothing. It may not be scientific evidence for anything, but it is data of a kind, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The tension between the scientific picture, in which we are a contingent byproduct of an indifferent universe, and the lived experience of meaning and purpose, in which our existence feels irreducibly significant, is one of the defining tensions of modern human culture. Every creation story has in its own way been an attempt to resolve this tension, to reconcile the vastness of the cosmos with the intimacy of individual human experience, to find in the structure of things a reason why we are here, to make the beginning of everything relevant to the middle of your particular life. The fear of the dark, origins as comfort. There is another dimension of the psychological need to understand origins that deserves its own quiet space in this exploration, one that is perhaps the most personal and the most achingly human of all. It is the dimension of fear, not the abstract intellectual discomfort of randomness, but the older, deeper fear that lives in the body, that wakes you in the night and will not be reasoned away. The fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, the fear behind all fears of non-existence. We are mortal creatures in an apparently immortal universe. Every human being who has ever lived has known, at some level, that their time here is limited, that the warmth of consciousness they carry within them will one day be extinguished, and that the world will continue without them as easily as it continued without them before they were born. This is, when you sit with it directly and fully, one of the most terrifying things imaginable. And yet every human civilization has, somehow, found ways to live with this knowledge, not to deny it entirely, but to contextualize it, to place it within a larger story that makes it bearable. Creation stories are part of that contextualization. If the universe had a beginning, then it has a shape, a narrative arc, and your life, brief as it is part of that arc. If the world was made by gods or emerged from a primordial intelligence or unfolded according to some great principle, then your consciousness is not simply an accidental byproduct of blind chemistry, here for a moment and then gone forever into nothing. You are, in some sense that varies by tradition, connected to the source, to the beginning, to the divine ground, to the pattern that underlies all things. The Egyptians built their entire civilization, in many ways, around this particular need. The pyramids, the elaborate mortuary rituals, the books of the dead with their detailed instructions for navigating the afterlife. All of this reflects a culture that took the question of what happens after death with the utmost seriousness, and that framed its answer within a specific understanding of how the cosmos was made and how it operated. The world was created by the gods as a place of order and meaning, ma'at, and the human soul, if it had lived according to ma'at, would be welcomed into the eternal order after death. The creation story was not separable from the death story. They were the same story, told from different ends of life's arc. In the Hindu tradition, the vast cosmological cycles of creation and dissolution offered a different kind of comfort. The individual life might be brief, but it was embedded in a process so immense and so enduring that its brevity was put in a different perspective, and through the mechanism of reincarnation, the soul passing from one body to another, accumulating karma and working toward eventual liberation, the individual was connected to the whole cosmic process in a deeply personal way. Your life now is one chapter in a story that began before you can remember and will continue after you're gone. The beginning of everything is also the beginning of your particular thread in the tapestry of existence. Even the scientific story of origins, told with sufficient depth and care, can provide something of this comfort. To know that the atoms in your body were forged in the hearts of dying stars is not to know that your consciousness survives death, but it is to know that you are made of something ancient and enduring, something that has been part of the cosmic story for billions of years and will continue to be part of it long after the particular configuration that is you has dissolved back into the world. You're not separate from the universe, looking at it from outside. You're a temporary form that the universe has taken, one of its most complex and beautiful forms, and when that form dissolves, the material that made it will go on to make other things, other configurations, other temporary bursts of pattern and meaning. This is not for everyone an adequate substitute for personal immortality. Many people need, and many traditions provide, a more direct and personal assurance that the self, the consciousness, the love and memory and identity that define an individual life will not simply cease at death. The creation stories of most traditions include, at least implicitly, an answer to this need. If the universe was made with intention, and by a power that cares about consciousness, then consciousness is likely to be more than a temporary flicker in the dark. The same power that made the beginning can be trusted with the endings. Whether or not any of this is literally true, whether consciousness survives death in any form, whether the universe was made with intention, whether there is any power that cares about us, these are questions that lie beyond the reach of current science, and perhaps beyond the reach of any empirical method. But the need that they respond to is real. The terror of non-existence is real. And the creation story, by embedding individual life within a larger and more enduring narrative, is one of the oldest and most powerful technologies that human beings have developed for living with that terror. Ritual and reenactment. Making the beginning present. One of the most fascinating aspects of creation stories is that they are rarely merely told. They are performed, enacted, made present in ritual, so that the beginning is not simply something that happened once, in the distant past, and is now fixed and finished, but something that happens again and again in the life of the community, renewed through ceremony and practice. The New Year festivals of the ancient Near East are a striking example. In Babylon, the Akitu festival, celebrated at the spring equinox, included a ritual reenactment of the Enuma Elish. The story of Marduk's defeat of Tiamat and the creation of the world was performed by priests and the king in the great temple complex of Babylon over a period of several days. This was not merely theatre. It was, in the understanding of the participants, a genuine renewal of the creative act, a re-establishment of cosmic order against the forces of chaos, a confirmation that the world would continue for another year. The same logic underlies the Eucharist in the Christian tradition. The Last Supper is not merely commemorated, but, in Catholic and many other traditions, actually made present again in the ritual of the Mass. The sacrifice of Christ, understood as a cosmic act of redemptive creation, is not a one-time historical event that is now over and done with, but an event that exists outside of time and that each celebration of the Eucharist brings into the present moment. In indigenous traditions around the world, the most sacred ceremonies are precisely those that recreate the events of the dreaming, the creation time, bringing the power of the beginning into the present through song, dance, and the use of sacred objects. The Navajo Blessing Way ceremony recreates the events of the emergence, guiding the participant through the stages of the world's creation and their own renewal within it. The healing power of the ceremony comes from its connection to the original creative power. By aligning oneself with the beginning, one participates in the ongoing process of creation and draws from its inexhaustible energy. This impulse to reenact the creation, to make the beginning present again, reflects a deep human intuition about time, that the past is not simply gone, but continues to be present in some way, continues to be active in the world. The power of the beginning is not exhausted by the original act of creation. It flows into the present, available to those who know how to access it. And the ritual enactment of the creation story is one of the primary technologies for accessing that power. Even in secular culture, we see traces of this impulse. National foundation myths, the stories of how a nation came into being, its revolutionary moments, its founding documents, are regularly reenacted and reaffirmed in national holidays and civic rituals. The 4th of July, Bastille Day, Independence Day. Celebrations of every kind are not merely historical commemorations. They are acts of civic renewal, affirmations of the founding principles, moments when the community reconnects with its own origin and draws from it a sense of identity and purpose. Creation stories are not only ancient, they are very much alive. Plato's Timaeus, the Creator's Dialogue. Among all of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus holds a special place in the history of cosmological thought. Written around 360 BCE, it presents an account of the creation of the universe that is simultaneously philosophical, mathematical, and mythological, a deliberate blending of modes of understanding that reflects Plato's conviction that the ultimate nature of reality is both rational and, in some sense, beyond purely rational comprehension. In the Timaeus, the world is created by a divine craftsman, the demiurge, from the Greek word for craftsman or artisan. The demiurge is not a creator from nothing, as in the later Abrahamic traditions. He is a maker, a craftsman who works with pre-existing materials. He takes the raw, chaotic, disorderly stuff of the world and imposes on it the rational mathematical forms that he contemplates in the realm of eternal ideas. He looks at the eternal mathematical patterns, the forms of the circle, the sphere, the regular geometrical solids, and uses them as templates to impose order on chaos. The universe is, in this vision, a work of art, a craftsman's imposition of mathematical beauty on formless matter. Plato's demiurge was motivated by goodness. He wanted to create the best possible world, a world that was as ordered, as rational, as beautiful as the eternal forms he was modelling it on. The universe is not the product of indifference or of blind necessity. It is the product of a benevolent intelligence's attempt to make something wonderful. This vision, that the universe was created out of divine goodness, as the best possible world, would echo through centuries of later philosophy and theology, from Plotinus to Augustine to Leibniz. The Timaeus also gave Western thought one of its most enduring cosmological images, the world as a living creature with a world soul. The demiurge did not make a mere mechanism, a dead machine. He created a living, unsouled cosmos, a cosmic animal, possessed of reason and intelligence, ordered by mathematical principles moving through the eternally repeated cycles of celestial motion that were the expression of its own rational nature. The universe, in Plato's vision, is alive in a way that goes beyond the sum of its parts. It has, as a whole, a kind of consciousness and intentionality. This Platonic cosmology was extraordinarily influential on early Christian thought. The Gospel of John's concept of the Logos, the word or rational principle through which God created the world, drew heavily on Platonic themes. The early Christian philosophers who attempted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian theology, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, all worked within a broadly Platonic framework, seeing in the Timaeus a partial and imperfect foreglimpse of the Christian doctrine of creation. For 1,000 years, the Timaeus was the most read text of classical philosophy in the Latin West, transmitted through a partial translation and commentary by the 4th century philosopher Chalcidius, and it shaped medieval European cosmological thinking in profound ways. The Aztec fifth sun, creation through sacrifice. Among the Aztec people of pre-Columbian central Mexico, the creation story was one of multiple worlds, 4 previous suns or ages, each governed by a different deity and each ending in catastrophe. The first sun was ruled by the god Tezcatlipoca and was destroyed when Quetzalcoatl struck Tezcatlipoca into the water and a jaguar ate the inhabitants. The second sun was ruled by Quetzalcoatl and was destroyed by wind. The third was destroyed by a rain of fire, the fourth by a great flood. Each previous world was an experiment that failed, each destroyed by the conflicts between the gods who governed it. The fifth sun, the current world, was created at the city of Teotihuacan. The gods gathered in darkness, for there was no sun. 2 gods volunteered to sacrifice themselves to become the new sun and moon. But the sun would not move across the sky. It hung, fixed, in the east, waiting. And a god named Ehecatl, the wind god, an aspect of Quetzalcoatl, blew the sun and then the moon into motion by sacrificing himself. But even this was not enough. The sun would not continue moving without being fed. The gods agreed to sacrifice themselves, all of them, to provide the blood that would power the sun's daily journey across the sky. And so, the world of the fifth sun was one sustained by sacrifice, by the constant offering of blood and life to maintain the cosmic order. The Aztec ritual calendar, with its elaborate ceremonies of sacrifice, was not merely religious practice in a narrow sense. It was a practical necessity, a maintenance schedule for the universe. If the sacrifices stopped, the sun would stop. The world would end in earthquake and darkness. This is a creation cosmology of stark, uncompromising logic. If the cosmos was created through sacrifice, and if it continues to operate through sacrifice, then the right relationship of human beings to the cosmos is one of continuous, conscious participation in the sacrifice that sustains it. The Aztec warriors who died in combat were understood to become companions of the sun, their blood and death feeding the celestial fire that kept the world alive. The sacrificial victims who died on the temple altars were not simply being killed. They were fulfilling the deepest purpose of existence, participating in the ongoing act of creation that every sunrise renewed. To modern eyes, this can seem monstrous, and the suffering inflicted in the name of this cosmology was real and terrible. But there is also, in the internal logic of the Aztec world, something that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The conviction that existence is not free, that life is not simply given without cost, that the world's continuation requires something from us. Not blood, perhaps, but some form of contribution, some giving of ourselves to the larger process that sustains the whole. Many traditions have held this conviction without the horrific ritual dimensions that Aztec practice took. The core intuition that we owe something to the world, that existence is a gift that demands a response, is one of the most widespread and enduring insights in human moral and religious thought. Francis Bacon and the New Science, commanding nature by obeying her. In the early 17th century, as the Copernican revolution was still being digested, and Galileo was peering through his new telescope at the moons of Jupiter, an English lawyer and statesman named Francis Bacon was writing a program for the transformation of human knowledge. Bacon was not a great scientist. He performed few experiments and made no major discoveries. But he was perhaps the most influential philosopher of science who has ever lived, because he articulated with clarity and passion what the new science was for and how it should be done. Bacon's central insight was that the purpose of understanding nature was not merely contemplative, not simply to satisfy human curiosity or to paint a philosophical picture of the cosmos, but practical. Nature could be understood in order to be controlled. We could improve the human condition, eliminate disease, extend life, reduce poverty and suffering by understanding the natural world and using that understanding to intervene in it. Knowledge was power, in Bacon's famous formulation, and the power was to be used in the service of human benefit. This vision was transformative. It reoriented the entire project of natural philosophy, what we would now call science, away from the Aristotelian ideal of pure theoretical understanding and toward what Bacon called the relief of man's estate. And it had a direct bearing on the question of origins, because one of the things that natural philosophy was newly empowered to investigate, without the constraint of religious orthodoxy, was the history of the natural world. How had the earth come to be as it is? How had the mountains formed, the rivers shaped their courses, the living things on the surface of the world come into existence? The Baconian program of empirical investigation observe nature systematically, record the observations, generalize from them cautiously to principles, test those principles against further observations, is the foundation of the scientific method as we practice it today. And it was this method that produced, over the following 3 centuries, the geology of Hutton and Lyell, the biology of Darwin, the physics of Newton and Einstein, and the cosmology of Hubble and Lemaitre. Bacon did not answer the question of origins, but he built, in some sense, the machine that would spend the next 4 centuries trying to answer it. The void in Buddhism, creation without a creator. The Buddhist tradition offers one of the most philosophically challenging approaches to the question of origins, challenging precisely because it refuses to answer the question in the expected way. The Buddha, in the early Buddhist texts, declined to speculate about the origin of the universe. When his followers asked whether the world was eternal or not eternal, finite or infinite, he compared the questions to those of a man shot with a poisoned arrow who insists on knowing the name, caste, and hometown of the person who shot him before he allows the arrow to be removed. The questions, said the Buddha, are not conducive to liberation. Attending to them will not help you end suffering. This is not ignorance. It is a sophisticated epistemological position. The Buddha was not saying that the origin of the universe is unknowable in principle. He was saying that the question of origins is not, for him, the most important question. The most important question is the one of suffering. Why do sentient beings suffer, and how can they be released from suffering? And that question does not depend on the answer to cosmological questions for its resolution. Later Buddhist philosophy, particularly the Madhyamaka school developed by the philosopher Nagarjuna in the 2nd century of the Common Era, offered a more detailed engagement with questions of origin and existence. Nagarjuna's central concept, sunyata or emptiness, holds that all phenomena lack inherent independent existence. Nothing exists by itself, from its own side, with its own intrinsic nature. Everything arises in dependence on other things, on causes and conditions, on relationships, on the perspective from which it is viewed. This is not nihilism. It does not say that nothing exists. It says that nothing exists independently. Applied to the question of origins, this teaching has a remarkable implication. Even the beginning of the universe lacks inherent existence. The Big Bang, the primordial chaos, the first moment, none of these has the kind of solid, independent, self-sufficient existence that we might naively assume it has. The beginning arises in dependence on the conditions that led to it, and those conditions arise in dependence on further conditions, in an infinite regress that Nagarjuna would say has no absolute starting point, no uncaused first cause, no entity that exists from its own side without dependence on anything else. This is a radical position, but it converges in interesting ways with some of the most puzzling aspects of modern physics. In quantum mechanics, particles do not have definite properties independent of observation and measurement. The state of a quantum system is, in some sense, not fully defined until it is observed. The universe at the quantum level does not consist of independently existing entities with fixed intrinsic properties, but of relational, contextual, measurement-dependent phenomena. The boundary between quantum mechanics and Buddhist philosophy of dependent origination is, philosophically speaking, less clear than one might expect. The Sumerian king list and the beginning of history. In the great museums of the world, the Ashmolean in Oxford, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, there is an ancient artifact that bridges the gap between mythology and history in a way that is both revealing and a little uncanny. It is the Sumerian king list, a cuneiform document from ancient Mesopotamia that records the kings of Sumer from the very beginning of time down to the compiler's own era. The document begins with those famous words, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was first in Eridu," and then it lists the first kings and their reigns. The first king of Eridu, Alolim, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000 years. The pattern continues, with pre-flood kings reigning for tens of thousands of years, until the Great Flood, an event treated in the king list as historical, just as it is in other Mesopotamian traditions including the Epic of Gilgamesh, swept over the earth, and kingship came to an end. Then kingship descended from heaven again, and the post-flood kings began, still with very long reigns at first but gradually shortening, generation by generation, until we reach figures who are historically verifiable. The Sumerian king list is a document that says something profound about how the Sumerians understood the beginning of their world. The beginning was not an abstract cosmological event. It was the beginning of civilization, the descent of kingship from heaven. The world existed in a meaningful sense only when organized political and social life began. Before the kings there was chaos and formlessness. The creation of the human world was the creation of civilization, of cities, of writing, of law, of the organized community. This is a profoundly political and cultural definition of creation, and it resonates with how many people in many cultures have felt, that the truly human world began not with the physical universe, but with the human community. The extraordinary reigns of the pre-flood kings, tens of thousands of years, reflect a feature of ancient Mesopotamian cosmological thinking that we also find in other traditions. The idea that the past was a time of greater power, greater wisdom, and greater closeness to the divine. The first kings were not merely political figures, they were semi-divine beings who had received kingship directly from heaven, who ruled over a world in which the gap between human and divine was much smaller than it later became. Over time the reigns grew shorter, the kings became more human, the divine connection became more attenuated. The present is a diminished version of the past. Creation was the most fully real and most fully alive moment, and everything since has been a gradual descent from that original fullness. This sense of a primordial golden age, a time of origins when everything was more fully what it should be, is strikingly widespread in human culture. The Greek Hesiod described the races of humanity descending from gold to silver to bronze to iron, each race more degraded and further from the divine than the last. The Vedic tradition described the cycle of 4 cosmic ages, the Satya Yuga, or Age of Truth, at the beginning, and the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, at the end, in which we now supposedly live, a time of diminished virtue and increased suffering. The book of Genesis tells of a paradise at the beginning, from which humanity fell into the harder, more laborious world of ordinary human experience. The longing for the beginning, the sense that the origin was better and more real than the present, is not merely historical sentiment. It is perhaps an expression of the human capacity for idealization, for imagining a perfection that exceeds anything actually given in experience. The origin is always, in some sense, a projection forward from the present, an image of what we wish we had, what we wish we were, what we imagine we would be if only we could return to the beginning and start fresh. The creation story is always also an expression of longing, Galileo's starry messenger, when observation changed everything. In March 1610, a small book of fewer than 60 pages was published in Venice that changed the human understanding of the cosmos more dramatically than anything since Copernicus. Galileo Galilei's Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger, reported the findings of the first systematic telescopic observations of the night sky, and what Galileo saw through his instrument destroyed several of the fundamental assumptions on which the traditional cosmology was based. Galileo saw that the moon was not a perfect smooth sphere, as Aristotelian philosophy held all celestial bodies must be, but a rugged world of mountains and valleys and craters, not so different in its physical character from the Earth. He saw that Jupiter had 4 moons orbiting it, which meant that not everything in the heavens moved around the Earth, as geocentric cosmology required. He saw that the Milky Way was not a continuous band of light, but a vast collection of individual stars, too numerous and too densely packed to be resolved by the naked eye. He saw that Venus went through phases, like the moon, which was explicable only if Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth. Each of these observations was individually a small thing, but together they amounted to a complete demolition of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmos that had organized European understanding of the universe for 15 centuries. The heavens were not perfect and unchanging. They were physical, material, changing, complex like the Earth. The Earth was not the center of all motion. Things moved around other centers. The universe was vastly larger than anyone had supposed, and the traditional authorities, Aristotle, Ptolemy, the Church, had been wrong about fundamental matters of fact. Galileo's fate is well known, his conflict with the Church, his trial by the Inquisition, his forced recantation, his house arrest for the last years of his life. He never renounced his scientific convictions, whatever he may have said under duress to his inquisitors, and the irony is that in his persecution, the Church inadvertently created a martyr for the cause of scientific inquiry, a symbol of the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even at great personal cost. Galileo became, in later centuries, the very image of the scientist as seeker of truth against the resistance of entrenched authority, an image that has shaped the self-understanding of science and its relationship to religion ever since. But Galileo himself was a complex figure, and his relationship to religious faith was not simple opposition. He believed deeply in God, and he believed that the book of nature was written in the language of mathematics, that God had made the world according to mathematical principles, and that understanding those principles was a form of glorifying the Creator. His conflict with the Church was not a conflict between science and religion per se, but a conflict over who had the authority to interpret the natural world, the Church's traditional theological hierarchy, or the empirical observations of individual investigators, this is a conflict that, in various forms, continues to this day. The flood stories. A universal memory. One of the most striking patterns in the world's creation mythology is the presence of flood stories in an enormous number of widely separated cultures. The biblical flood of Noah is the version most familiar to Western readers, but it is far from unique. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical account and shares many of its details, tells the story of Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Ea to build a great boat and save the animals and his family from a flood sent by the gods. The Vedic tradition tells of Manu, the first man, who was warned by a fish, later revealed to be the god Vishnu in disguise, that a great flood was coming, and who built a boat that was guided to safety when the waters rose. In the Americas, the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, of the Pacific coast, and of many other regions preserved flood stories of their own. In Greece, the flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Greek equivalents of Noah and his wife, was a familiar part of the mythological tradition, told by Ovid and Pindar and many others. In China, the legendary hero Gun and his son Yu spent decades engineering an end to a great flood that had inundated the land. In Australia, various indigenous traditions speak of a time when the seas rose and covered much of the land. The universality of flood stories across human cultures is one of the most enduring puzzles in comparative mythology. Several explanations have been proposed. Some scholars argue that the stories reflect actual memories of significant flooding events that occurred as the last ice age ended and sea levels rose dramatically, flooding vast coastal plains, submerging river valleys, drowning coastal settlements whose descendants carried the memory of the inundation forward in story. The flooding of the Black Sea basin approximately 7,600 years ago, when the rising Mediterranean broke through a land barrier and inundated what had previously been a much smaller freshwater lake, dramatically and rapidly, has been proposed as one possible origin for the Mesopotamian flood stories. Other scholars argue that the universality of flood stories reflects not historical events, but the universal human experience of flood, that in any agricultural society dependent on rivers, floods are among the most terrifying and significant natural events, and it is not surprising that they should figure prominently in creation and destruction mythology. Water, as we have seen, is the universal beginning, the primordial substance, and the flood is a return to the primordial water, an erasure of the created world and a return to the formlessness from which it came. The flood story is, in this reading, a mirror image of the creation story. Just as creation brought order from the primordial waters, the flood brings a return to primordial waters and a chance to begin again. What is certain is that flood stories speak to something deeply felt in human experience, the vulnerability of the world we build, the possibility of catastrophic loss, and the hope for renewal after destruction. They are stories about ending and beginning, about the fragility of civilization and the resilience of life, about the relationship between humanity and the forces of nature that simultaneously sustain and threaten it. They belong to the same family of concerns as the creation stories themselves, and in many traditions the flood story is the creation story. The world after the flood is the real world, the world fit for human habitation, shaped by the experience of catastrophic loss and miraculous survival. The Fermi paradox. Are we alone in asking? In 1950, the physicist Enrico Fermi was lunching with colleagues at Los Alamos National Laboratory when he asked a question that has haunted the scientific imagination ever since. The Milky Way galaxy is approximately 10 billion years old. It contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Many of these stars have planets. Given the chemical universality we've established, that the building blocks of life appear throughout the cosmos, it seems reasonable to suppose that life has arisen on many of them. If even a small fraction of those planets have produced intelligent technological civilizations, and if even a few of those civilizations have developed the means of interstellar travel or communication, then the galaxy should be by now full of signals and perhaps full of visitors. So, asked Fermi, where is everybody? This is the Fermi paradox, and it remains one of the most profound unanswered questions in science. If intelligent life is common in the universe, why have we detected no signals of it? Why have we not been visited or found the remnants of past visits? Why is the universe, as far as we can tell, silent? The possible answers to the Fermi paradox are numerous and deeply unsettling. Perhaps intelligent life is far rarer than we assume. Perhaps the development of complex multicellular life, or of nervous systems, or of intelligence capable of technological civilization, represents a series of extraordinary improbabilities that have occurred only once here. Perhaps we are, in a cosmos of trillions of stars, alone or nearly alone. This is called the rare Earth hypothesis, and it is taken seriously by some scientists. Alternatively, perhaps intelligent civilizations are common, but inevitably destroy themselves before they can reach the stars. Perhaps every civilization that develops the kind of technology required for interstellar communication or travel also develops, at roughly the same time, the capacity to destroy itself, through nuclear weapons, through environmental catastrophe, through runaway artificial intelligence, through any of the many ways that a technologically capable species might go wrong. If this is true, if there is a great filter that prevents civilizations from surviving long enough to become visible, then the silence of the universe is a warning. We may be approaching that filter ourselves, or perhaps the universe is full of civilizations, but they are not communicating in ways we can detect, or they are communicating on timescales or in modes that are beyond our current understanding. Perhaps they have transcended the physical limitations that constrain us. Perhaps interstellar distances are simply so vast that even civilizations with peaceful intentions and advanced technology find it effectively impossible to reach each other. Perhaps they are out there, as alone as we are, asking the same questions, wondering the same things, looking into their own versions of the night sky, and feeling the same vertiginous sense of wonder and smallness, and the burning need to understand. The Fermi paradox connects directly to the question of origins, because it raises the possibility that the asking of the question, the development of consciousness sophisticated enough to wonder about its own beginning, is itself an extraordinarily rare event. If we are alone or nearly alone in the universe, then the emergence of consciousness here, on this pale blue dot, represents something that has cosmic significance of a very particular kind. We may be, as far as the observable universe is concerned, the only place where the universe is asking about itself, the only mirror in which the cosmos sees its own face. Whether this thought fills you with terror or with awe, or most likely with both simultaneously, it is a thought that takes the ancient question of origins and charges it with new and urgent meaning. If consciousness is rare, then the consciousness that asks where everything came from is precious beyond measure. And the care with which we cultivate it, the honesty with which we pursue the question, the courage with which we follow the evidence wherever it leads, are not merely intellectual virtues. They are perhaps a cosmic responsibility. Language and creation, naming the world into being. In many of the creation stories we've explored, language plays a central and often primary role. The Hebrew God speaks the world into existence. The Hindu texts describe the sound Om, the primordial vibration, as the basis of all creation. The Dogon people of West Africa associate the origin of the world with the spoken word of the creator Amma. The Mayan creation in the Popol Vuh begins with the creator gods thinking and speaking together. They spoke each thing into being. This widespread conviction that language and creation are intimately connected is not, I think, simply primitive confusion about the power of words. It reflects a genuine and profound insight about the relationship between language and reality, an insight that philosophy of language has been grappling with since at least the ancient Greeks, and that has acquired new dimensions with the development of modern linguistics and cognitive science. Language does not merely describe a pre-existing world, it structures experience. The categories and distinctions embedded in a language shape what its speakers notice, how they organize their perception, what they find similar and what they find different. The Piraha people of the Amazon, whose language lacks recursion and tense markers, appear to organize their experience of time and narrative in ways that differ markedly from speakers of Indo-European languages. The Hopi people, according to the controversial but still influential analysis of Benjamin Lee Horff, conceive of time and event in a way that differs fundamentally from the space-time model embedded in most European languages. More fundamentally, language is the medium in which the distinctively human world is built. The human world, the world of institutions, laws, promises, money, nations, marriages, corporations, exists not in physical reality, but in the shared beliefs and the speech acts of the community. Money is just paper, unless everyone agrees to treat it as money. A marriage is just two people standing near each other, unless the community witnesses and affirms the commitment. A nation is just a piece of geography, unless there are stories and symbols and agreements that bind its people into a shared political identity. Language, specifically the kind of performative, institution-creating language that philosophers call speech acts, is what creates the human world. In this sense, the creation stories that attribute cosmic origins to a divine word are not simply wrong. They are pointing toward a genuine truth about the specific kind of creation that human beings do. We create our world with words. We create ourselves with the stories we tell about who we are. We create the future with the commitments and promises we make. Language is, in this very real sense, a creative force, and the creation story that puts the word at the beginning of everything is acknowledging, in mythological form, something that philosophy and cognitive science are still working to fully understand. The universe 14 billion years later. A moment of reflection. Let us pause before we reach our conclusion and try to do something genuinely difficult. To hold in our minds, simultaneously, the full vastness of cosmic history and the intimacy of this present moment. 14 billion years ago, give or take a few 100 million, the universe began. Not in a place, because there was no space yet. Not at a time, because there was no time yet. Something that our mathematics can begin to describe, but that our imagination cannot fully grasp, occurred. And from that occurrence, space and time and energy unfolded, expanded, cooled, structured itself. Over millions of years, the first clouds of hydrogen and helium collapsed under gravity into the first stars, and those stars burned and exploded and seeded the cosmos with carbon and oxygen and iron and all the heavier elements. Galaxies formed. Vast spiral and elliptical systems of hundreds of billions of stars orbiting each other through the dark. On the outer arm of one such galaxy, an unremarkable yellow star formed from a collapsing cloud of gas and dust, and around it, from the debris of the collapse, a system of planets formed, including one small, warm, water-bearing planet at just the right distance from the star to allow liquid water on its surface. On that planet, approximately 4 billion years ago, something happened that has not, as far as we know, happened anywhere else in the observable universe. Chemistry became biology. Self-replicating molecules arose, perhaps in warm tidal pools, perhaps in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, perhaps on mineral surfaces that catalyzed the first reactions. Life began. Blindly, incrementally, over billions of years that life evolved, becoming more complex, more diverse, more capable. Cells developed nuclei. Multicellular organisms appeared. The great explosion of animal body plans in the Cambrian 500 million years ago. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And eventually on the African savanna, a particular line of social, upright, large-brained primates developed the capacity for language, for cumulative culture, for the transmission of knowledge across generations. And one night, perhaps 100,000 years ago, perhaps more, one of those primates sat beside a fire, looked up at the sky and asked, "How did all of this begin?" That question has never stopped. It has been asked in every human language, in every human culture, in every human era. It has been asked by people who are dying and people who had just been born, by people who are triumphant and people who are desperate, by people who had everything and people who had nothing. It has been asked in palaces and in prisons, in temples and in laboratories, in the quiet of the night and the noise of the day. It is being asked right now by millions of people around the world, in the form of prayer and meditation and scientific inquiry and the private, unrecorded wanderings of ordinary lives. And here you are, reading or listening to this long story about the story, this attempt to trace the thread of the asking back through time. You are part of the lineage. You are carrying the question forward. Whatever you believe about its ultimate answer, whether you find comfort in the scientific story, or in the religious story, or in some combination, or whether you hold the question open with a kind of patient agnosticism, you're doing the most human thing there is. You're wondering, you're reaching, you're refusing to be fully content with not knowing. The universe is 14 billion years old. Life on Earth is 4 billion years old. Our species is perhaps 300,000 years old. Civilization is perhaps 10,000 years old. The scientific method is perhaps 500 years old. And the question that started all of it, the question that underlies all of civilization and all of science and all of philosophy and all of religion, is as old as the human mind itself. We have been at this for a long time, we have come a very long way, and we still have so very far to go. That is not a frustration, it is an invitation. The question of origins is not a problem to be solved and finished with, but a horizon that accompanies us, that gives us something to walk toward, that gives the journey a direction without diminishing the joy of the walking. The destination, if there is one, is far away, but the path itself is extraordinary. Look at what we have found along the way. The Milky Way, the Big Bang, evolution, the structure of DNA, the cosmic microwave background, the vast ancient traditions of human wisdom preserved in stories and ceremonies and texts across 5 continents and 50,000 years. Look at the company we've had. Every thinker who ever grappled honestly with the mystery, every storyteller who ever tried to put the beginning into words, every scientist who ever spent their life's work pushing the frontier a little further back. We're in good company. We're part of something old and vast and genuinely beautiful. And wherever we go from here, whatever the next discoveries are, whatever the next stories we tell ourselves will be, we will be carrying with us the oldest and most essentially human thing we possess. The need to understand, the need to ask, the reach toward the beginning. We have travelled a long way together in this story, from the campfires of 50,000 years ago to the particle accelerators of the 21st century, from the clay tablets of Babylon to the data streams of orbiting telescopes, from the first person who looked at the night sky and felt the question form in their chest, to the physicists and cosmologists who spend their working lives wrestling with equations that describe the first trillionths of a second of cosmic history. What does this long journey reveal about us? About the creatures who ask these questions, who have always asked them, who cannot seem to stop asking them, even when the answers are elusive and partial, and sometimes more disorienting than the questions they replace. It reveals, first and most simply, that we are restless. The human mind is not content with things as they are. It is not enough to live in the world. We must understand the world. We must situate it, explain it, give it a narrative. Even in the most extreme conditions of material hardship and survival pressure, even in the caves and the ice and the desert, our ancestors found the time and the energy to ask the big questions and to attempt to answer them. The question of origins is not a luxury item that only comfortable, well-fed civilizations concern themselves with. It is a fundamental human need, as primary as the need for food and shelter and companionship. It reveals, second, that we are humble, or at least that we can be when we are at our best. The most honest creation stories, across cultures and across history, have always acknowledged the limits of what can be known. The Nasadiya Suktas, perhaps he does not know. The Tao Te Chings, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Hawking's acknowledgement that quantum cosmology leaves fundamental questions unanswered. The scientist who publishes a result knows that the result will be refined and perhaps overturned by later work. The mystic who enters the silence of meditation knows that the ultimate mystery exceeds what language can contain. Both are acts of humility in the face of something larger than themselves. It reveals, third, that we are communal. The creation stories of every culture are communal property, told and retold by the community, performed in ceremony, carried in shared memory. Even the most solitary of scientists works within a community, citing predecessors, publishing for peers, building on a shared edifice of knowledge. The quest to understand origins is not a solitary heroic act. It is a collective undertaking, distributed across time and space, with each generation adding its contribution and passing the question on to the next. It reveals, fourth, that we are imaginative in a way that no other species appears to be. The capacity to look at what is and envision what must have been, to reconstruct the past from present evidence, to imagine the first moment before any moment existed. This is a specifically human capability. No other species, as far as we know, has developed origin myths. No other species wonders about its own beginning. The wondering is us. The wondering is what we are. And it reveals finally that we are connected to each other across time and geography and to the universe that we're trying to understand. The atoms in your body were forged in stars. The questions in your mind are the same questions that have occupied the minds of the Sumerian priests and the Greek philosophers and the Vedic sages and the Islamic astronomers and the Renaissance scientists and every ordinary person who has ever looked up at the sky and felt the question press against the inside of their chest. The quest for the beginning is itself a beginning, a point from which all human civilization has in some sense departed. And the fact that we share it, all of us, in every time and every place, is perhaps the most profound expression of our kinship with each other and with the long, strange, unfolding story of this cosmos. And so we arrive, at last, at the quiet end of this long exploration. Not an ending, really. There are no endings in a story like this, only resting places. Places where you can pause and look back at how far you have come and look forward at how far there is still to go. We have walked through the great creation stories of the ancient world and felt the power they have even now, even for those of us who do not hold them as literally true, to speak to something essential in our experience, the need for meaning, the terror of randomness, the longing to understand our place in a universe that is enormously larger and older than we can fully comprehend. We've sat with the first philosophers as they dared to ask whether the world could explain itself, without recourse to divine will, and felt the exhilarating and sometimes vertigo-inducing freedom of that project. We have followed the scientists as they extended human sight backward in time, pushing the horizon of the knowable ever closer to the beginning, and marvelled at what they found, a universe of almost incomprehensible age and scale, arising from a single, hot, dense point, governed by mathematical laws of breathtaking elegance, carrying in its cosmic microwave background the faint echo of its own birth. And we have, I hope, begun to see that all of these, the myths, the philosophy, the science, are chapters in the same long story. The story of a species that could not stop asking. The story of a mind that found itself in a universe it could not quite understand and refused to simply accept that situation. The story of the extraordinary, sometimes maddening, often beautiful human need to know. There is a passage in Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot that I think about often when I think about this question. Sagan was reflecting on a photograph of the Earth taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft in 1990 from a distance of approximately 6 billion kilometers. In the photograph, the Earth appears as a tiny point of light, a pale blue dot, barely distinguishable against the vastness of deep space. And Sagan wrote, "Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. This is a sobering vision." But Sagan didn't stop there. He went on, "Our planet is the only world known so far to harbour life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. The smallness of our position in the cosmos is not, in Sagan's vision, a reason for despair. It is a reason for a particular kind of responsibility, a responsibility to cherish what we have, to recognize that our life here on this pale blue dot is not guaranteed by any cosmic arrangement, and that the things we have built, our civilizations, our cultures, our stories, our science, our art, our love for each other, are precious precisely because they exist in the midst of such vast indifference. The creation stories we have told throughout history have served many purposes, political, social, psychological, spiritual. But perhaps their deepest and most enduring purpose has been to say, you matter. The world you inhabit was made by gods, by the Big Bang, by billions of years of cosmic evolution, and it was made in a way that allowed you to exist. And you, existing in it, carry the capacity to understand it, to appreciate it, to find it beautiful, to love the other beings who exist within it. You are not an accident, even if your existence is not the product of divine intention. You are the universe becoming aware of itself. You are the cosmos looking at itself in the mirror of consciousness and finding it extraordinary. The question of how everything started is not a question with a final answer. It is a question that grows with us, that takes new forms as our knowledge grows, that reveals new layers of mystery as each layer of the known is peeled back. In every age we have thought we were approaching the answer, and in every age we have found that the answer opened onto more questions, and that the mystery was deeper and richer than we had imagined. This is not a failure. This is what it means to genuinely engage with a question this large. The universe is older than we can viscerally comprehend, and stranger than our intuitions can easily accommodate, and more beautiful than we have words to fully express. The fact that we keep reaching for it, keep trying to understand it, keep sitting up in the middle of the night, literally or metaphorically, And asking the oldest question is not a sign of our inadequacy. It is a sign of our greatness. Somewhere tonight, in this very moment, a physicist is running a simulation of the early universe on a supercomputer, watching the first seeds of structure emerge from the primordial chaos. Somewhere, a child is lying on her back in the grass, looking up at a sky full of stars she cannot yet name, feeling the first stirring of the question she will spend her life trying to answer. Somewhere an elder is telling a story, a creation story, in whatever language and tradition is hers, and the children listening to her are learning not just the story, but something more important, that the world has a beginning, and that beginning means something, and that they are connected to it, and to each other, and to all the generations that have told and listened to this story before them. All of these people, the physicist, the child, the storyteller, are part of the same long human conversation. They're all asking the same question, in their different ways, with their different tools and their different languages and their different levels of technical sophistication. And the asking itself, the very fact of the asking, is perhaps the most important answer any of them will find. Because to ask how everything started is to assert that the question matters. It is to insist that the universe is the kind of place that can be understood, at least in part. It is to claim membership in the long tradition of human curiosity that stretches back to the very first campfire, the very first pair of eyes that turned upward in the dark and wondered. It is to take your place in the chain, that long, luminous, unbroken chain of seekers that connects the cave painters of Lascaux to the astronomers of the James Webb Space Telescope, the Vedic sages to the particle physicists of CERN, the Zuni elders to the philosophers of Oxford and Tokyo and Nairobi. You are part of that chain. Simply by wondering, simply by finding yourself drawn to this question, this night, in whatever corner of the world you inhabit, you are part of the oldest and most characteristically human project there is. You are the universe asking about itself, and that, of all the remarkable things this universe has managed to produce in 13.8 billion years of restless creative becoming, is perhaps the most remarkable of all. The question of how everything started will not be answered tonight. It may not be answered in our lifetimes, or in the lifetimes of our children's children. The frontier will move, as it has always moved, pushed back by each new discovery, each new theory, each new observation that lets us see a little further into the darkness. But the darkness beyond the frontier will remain, and the question will remain, and human beings will keep reaching toward it with everything they have. And perhaps that is, in its own way, a kind of answer, not to the question of what came before the beginning, but to the question of what we are. We are the creatures who cannot stop asking. We are the creatures for whom the question itself is a source of meaning, of wonder, of the particular kind of joy that comes not from certainty, but from the honest, open-eyed, inexhaustible engagement with mystery. The stars above you are still there, the same ones that were above the first person who asked this question, the same patterns, the same ancient light, travelling the same impossible distances through the same incomprehensible dark. They have been watching this project of ours for a very long time, and if they have any opinion of it, which of course they do not, because stars are not conscious, which is itself a remarkable fact about the universe, I imagine it would be something like appreciation. Because the universe, for most of its existence, was dark and silent and without awareness of any kind. And then, on one small planet, something happened that had never happened anywhere in the cosmos before, as far as we know. The universe developed the capacity to wonder about itself, to ask, to reach. 13.8 billion years of cosmic history, and it produced this. You, in your quiet corner of the world, in the middle of this night or this morning or this afternoon, listening to a story about the beginning of everything and feeling the question stir in you like something alive, like something that has always been there, waiting. That is not nothing. In a universe almost entirely composed of emptiness and silence and unconscious matter, that is one of the rarest and most precious things that exists. Take care of it, feed it, follow it where it leads. Because the question, your question, the one you carry in the quiet moments, the one that wakes you up at strange hours and makes the ordinary world suddenly strange and vast and full of depth, that question is not a problem to be solved and set aside. It is a companion. It is the oldest companion our species has, and it has been keeping us company, keeping us curious, keeping us reaching, ever since the first fire burned against the first darkness and the first mind looked up and wondered. Good night.